What pops into your mind when I say the word lunch? You're probably thinking a sandwich, cheeseburger and fries, soup and salad, Taco Tuesday, chicken salad, pizza. Whatever it is, it needs to be something quick and easy. But 250 years ago, it was nothing like that. To a working man, lunch was the most important meal of the day. He couldn't go on without it. We just got done thinking about what happens with breakfast, and that made me think about lunch. And the perfect book for that is William Ellis's book from 1750, where he tells us all about the meals for laborers. What was life like for the working class in the 18th century? It's a question I ask myself because today most people that we think of here in America are middle class, but there isn't quite that thing happening either in America or in Great Britain in the 18th century. Most people are working class, what we would call maybe even low class or lower middle class. They're people doing very blue collar like jobs, and they have a different kind of life than we do completely. They're working from dawn to dusk. And when you work hard like that, you have to eat in a different way than we certainly do today. I mean, most of us could probably skip 2 meals and not even really notice it. So we're talking here about the people who are working on farms, regular field workers. We're talking about blacksmiths and people that are doing those standard jobs, potters, ironsmiths, tailors. All these folks are working hard every day, 6 days a week. And so many jobs today, we commute. We might commute 10, 15 minutes or an hour to get to work. Most people in the 18th century are not doing that at all. They're working rather close to home or even in their home. So dealing with lunch is a totally different kind of concept. They don't have to go out to eat. They are right at their home. They're ready to eat there. Or sometimes the meals are brought out to them. They're field workers and the food is brought out to them so they don't have to take any major break in the day, but they can eat right there. So today we typically have these 3 meals in a day. We have a breakfast, we have a lunch, we have a dinner, that dinner being the large meal of the day, the one that's most filling. And these other ones are just sort of fillers to keep us from getting hungry until we get to dinner. But that's not what's typical in the 18th century. Yes, we're having something maybe very early in the morning, and then we might start to do some work, and then we'll have something like a breakfast, then we'll work until the midday, till about 1 o'clock, and that's dinner. That's the major meal of the day. And then later on, much later on, maybe even after the sun has gone down, we have a light supper, and then it's time for bed. So what are we eating in this larger midday meal, which they called their dinner? Well, if we dig into William Ellis's Country Housewife's Family Companion, we have a lot of references specifically to dinner. And they're working with families and workmen that work on the farm. And he does this great job all the way through the book in many different spots where he says, this will make a good dinner, or that'll make a good dinner. Here on page 71, William Ellis gives us a great description of dinner. He says, at dinner time, which should always be at 1 o'clock, the victuals should be in the field. For it was the saying of a noble housewife, that as the men expected it at that hour, if it was not brought accordingly, they would lag in their work and lose time in expecting it. Broad beans and bacon or pork one day, and beef with carrots or turnips or cabbage or cucumbers or potatoes another day, and a plum pudding at wheat time harvest or a plain pudding in Lent harvest. Good dinner victuals. So it's fun, even as we dig through a book like this, William Ellis talks about all kinds of things that will work for a dinner. Some things that we would find rather strange. So it'll say something like a white pot, which we would definitely consider basically a sugary bread pudding. He would consider that the entire dinner, or maybe just a large pudding, one of those boiled puddings like we think of as in the Christmas Carol with Charles Dickens, On Fire, right? So that could also be your dinner, your midday meal. They're usually just one dish and maybe shared within the entire family or all the workers at once. Things that we just wouldn't think of as really appropriate for lunch at all. Another great book for working class meals is the Primitive Cookery Cookbook, done in 1767, and it's a collection specifically for meals for working class people, even this low class working people. And in the back, it's a list of 72 meals, and they are all over the place. Something like oatmeal or green beans, dumplings, which we've done here. And many of them say this will make a good meal, that this is good for the working class family. And many times, or basically all the time, they're talking about dinner here. They're talking about the main meal of the day, not breakfast. In past videos, we have talked about some of these same sorts of things. The Benjamin Franklin meal, which is the bread and cheese and something like water, sometimes that's breakfast. Many times that is a typical lunchtime meal or dinner time. We also have something that, again, we've talked about that would be breakfast, which would be oatmeal, a porridge. Yep, that could certainly be your dinner time, or even something like a milk porridge, which is just milk with bread crumbed up in it and sort of heated up, which not too many people I think eat today. As we dig into what's written here, the meals are large. So it seems that dinner has a lot more to do with how big the meal is, how it's supposed to get you through the day, rather than exactly the type of food that we're eating. Most of the references here with William Ellis, he's talking about field workers. And whether it's breakfast or dinner, those meals are brought right out into the field for them so that they can eat and then get back to work. But a lot of these other workers, maybe they're a blacksmith or some other kind of worker in town, they are so close to home, they can take a break, they can go home, the meal's already been prepared for them, they can eat and then get back to work. So it gives them a nice little break during the day. They don't have to worry about fast food or doing any great quantity of commuting. The main dish we're going to do today is the one right out of the middle of the section here. It's beef with carrots and potatoes. Many times in the 18th century, this would just be boiled beef with potatoes and carrots. That doesn't sound so appetizing. So another way they would cook them in the 18th century is to cook them in a Dutch oven. We would call it a pot roast, and it is so good. Our dish of beef, potatoes, and carrots is rather simple. We're going to take our beef and do a little bit of spicing with it. Salt and pepper, rub that in. You could even put a little nutmeg on it if you want to. And we're going to sear this in our Dutch oven. A little bit of oil, and make sure to brown all the sides of this wonderful beef. Once that's done, we can put in our sliced carrots and potatoes. Add some water in that. You want to come almost up to the top of the meat. Put the lid on that, and it goes into our oven, or in this case, we're going to put coals above and below it, and it needs to be cooked at about 350 degrees for an hour or two. The more I dig, the more I'm kind of caught off guard by the fact that there's so much variety here, but many circumstances, these dishes are meat dishes. These are fairly lowly people, really. They're not even kind of middle-class folks, but meat is available for many of these dishes. And while it might not be a high-class cut of meat, meat is on the table. Even the dish we're cooking today doesn't need to be some incredibly wonderful cut of beef. It can be a fairly inexpensive cut, and the way it's cooked still turns out wonderfully tender. Yes, lunch for us is something simple. We'll get it from a fast food restaurant, or maybe we'll bring our food in. But it's just something to get us through the hungry spot in the middle of the day. In the 18th century, it is the most important meal. It is the biggest meal. It's basically usually just one dish like this, meat and vegetables all cooked together. Maybe it's one thing or the other, but it is the most substantial meal of the day. This smells so good. It is such a quick one-pot meal. The beef, the vegetables, all cooked together. And, well, let's try it out. Cooked to perfection. This is probably the very best lunch, whether today or 250 years ago. Trade into the interior of North America was a perilous job in the 18th and early 19th century. Voyagers were going deep into the interior of North America to trade with Native Americans for furs and meat. The trade is powered by man, paddling canoes for hundreds of miles, for hours and hours at a time. This takes a lot of food. A voyageur in this time period is burning more than 3,000 calories a day, probably 4,000 or 5,000 calories. This kind of work takes a tremendous quantity of energy. It takes a very calorically dense food source to be able to survive in this job. This would not be possible without pemmican, the ultimate survival food. Pemmican, as referenced in our time period, is a meat source, generally bison. The bison are butchered and the meat is cut into very thin slices across the grain. This is then dried, and the best way to dry it is drying it in the sun. If the meat needs to be dried over the fire, that'll still work, but we need to have a very, very dried meat source. We're trying to drive every bit of moisture out. If we don't, the pemmican won't work right. It won't last. This pemmican is then pounded up into a fiber, almost pulverized. This is mixed then with the suet of the bison, a mixture of 50-50 or maybe 2-to-1 meat to suet. And the suet has to be nice and hot. We want the suet to cover every portion of the meat. This is kind of like the potted meat source that we talked about in previous episodes. The idea is that we don't want any air or any moisture getting to these meat fibers. The prepared pemmican is then placed in a leather bag, and this bag is made from the hide of the bison. It is incredible that basically all the meat and fat from one bison gets dehydrated and packed into the skin of that very bison. This is an incredibly efficient way of processing the animal and turning it into this very, very condensed food source. The people best known for this innovative food are the Métis people in Canada. Now, they are people with French roots and Native American roots, but they're there at the right place and at the right time to turn this needed food product into a whole industry. This was not a new concept in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Pemmican has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years before that. Native Americans all over North America were doing this process with different kinds of meat, especially something like venison. This was a way of making this wonderful food, a very, very dense and nutritious food, but also a food that'll last a long time, and a delicacy at times, depending on how it was prepared. But it's only in this late 18th century and early 19th century context that it turns into a huge industry. The Métis people are already using this as a food source before the early 19th century. But at that point, it is realized that this is the kind of food that everyone needs if they want to get into the interior of North America. When the Native Americans developed pemmican previous to the 18th century, it was developed as a food source made out of animal meat, the fats, and sometimes even things like berries, service berries, chokecherries, or even something like currants. And the fats that were included in pemmican were usually softer, more tasty fats. This kind of pemmican wasn't necessarily good for long-term storage. It was really intended to taste better, to make it more edible. Right at the turn of the 19th century, pemmican was reformulated specifically for long-term storage. So the soft fats that made the very, very highly edible pemmican, that was changed. And they brought in the much harder internal fats from inside of the bison. Now they formulated this with about a 50-50 mix of the softer fats to give it just the right kind of texture. But this new formulation was made so that the pemmican could last for years, especially if it was kept very dry. So this new pemmican could easily last a year or two, or maybe even a decade. When we look at the ratio of the amount of cargo per man, it's very interesting. A sailor in the 18th century moving goods from, say, North America to Europe, he can usually do about 10 or 20 tons per man in a ship. By comparison, a voyageur in the time period can only take about 500 pounds. It's about 40 times more efficient for a sailor to move goods than it is that poor voyageur's. He's got a very hard job. Pemmican comes onto the stage here in the late 18th century. Before that, there's certainly a lot of fur trade happening, and that fur trade is powered by cornmeal and lard. It wasn't until this late 18th century time period that we have the technological leap of pemmican coming onto the scene. Now this is incredible. The ability of the voyageurs to travel so much farther on pemmican than they could on the cornmeal and lard. So how much of a technological leap was this? The voyageurs in the time period had contests. They would paddle across lakes for long distances. Before pemmican becomes the food source, generally the top speed at which a voyager could paddle was 40 times a minute. When pemmican comes onto the scene, it moves up to 60. That is a tremendous increase in speed. So that's why pemmican is so very, very important. Without it, you could not do this trade. It wouldn't be possible. Pemmican isn't just an incredibly dense food source, it's an energy boost. This makes it so that the voyageurs can endure much longer voyages. Pemmican starts off as a small concept in the 1780s and 1790s, but it becomes a big industry by the time we get into the early 19th century. Not only does it help trade happen, but it becomes a major trade item. It gets traded to people like the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. It is big business. And it's not just used for trade right there in that area, but it's used by explorers all over in the Northern Hemisphere. If you want to go to the North Pole, you eat pemmican. Pemmican in the time period was not known for being a wonderfully palatable food source. Now, that's kind of important for a survival food. You don't want it to be really, really good, so you eat it all up at once. You really could not do that with pemmican. It was good in that you could eat it raw if you needed to. And there were times that people wanted to paddle for long periods of time and they would eat it raw as they were paddling. You can't do that with just any food source. But normally to make it more, let's say, edible, they would turn it into dishes. They would use it as an ingredient. They had a soup called rubaboo, and they also had a stew that they would make that we'd call rousseau. Anything you can add to this, cornmeal, root vegetables, ship's biscuits, any of these will make it a much tastier meal. Here's part of a narrative from 1790. On the banks of the river there were plenty of wild onions, which when mixed up with our pemmican was a great improvement to it. It's been almost a decade since we did our first series on pemmican, and there's been a great resurgence in the interest in pemmican in the last few years. It doesn't matter whether you're a hunter, a hiker, anyone looking for this wonderful, powerful food source, pemmican is still the ultimate survival food. We've all heard the saying that an army marches on its stomach. Food is one of the most important parts of a soldier's equipment. Without food, you can't fight. It's hard enough to feed an army today or maybe 50 or 100 years ago, but during the Revolutionary War, it was nearly impossible. Soldiers in this time period had a problem with rations, the lack of them, and the fact that they were so poor. They had poor equipment and impossible conditions. Whenever I think I'm having a bad day and I need perspective, all I need to do is look back on this time period, these soldiers, think about the hardships they had. Anytime I want, I can go to the fridge, I can take food out, I can cook it in any number of cooking vessels. I can eat to my heart's content whenever. And every single night, I get to lay out on a warm bed and go to sleep for as long as I want. In past episodes, we've talked about the food, the rations, and how they were distributed. And even the Soldier's Feast episode, where we talked about the difficulties they had in getting their food. What I want to talk about today is their mess kit, their cooking equipment, how they prepared their food, what did they use for equipment in the field. Imagine it's 250 years ago, and you've been given the assignment for a year to cook for 6 men, and you have to be able to carry the equipment on your back. You have one choice, one cooking implement. What are you going to choose? Maybe a frying pan, or a saucepan, or a big pot. Well, what did they have in the 18th century or in the Revolutionary War specifically? They had the cook kettle. The cook kettle was the standard cooking implement, whether you were a British troop or an American troop. It was always about this size, somewhere between 2.5 to 3 gallons, about 10 inches high and about 10 inches around. It looks like a bucket or even a paint can. It is basically the equivalent of a stock pot today. They cooked everything in this. And I think this was for a reason. The officers that were in charge of supplying the army, and they wanted soldiers to only cook one kind of thing. They wanted them to cook soups and stews. They didn't want them frying their food or broiling it. They thought that was a wasteful way of cooking, and that this was the most nutritious way to use their rations. So they said, let's give them one kind of cooking implement. It's nice, it's lightweight, we can use it for a lot of different things. We can carry our supplies in it, we can carry our food in it, we can carry water in it. So it was a versatile piece of equipment. Now, sometimes people tried to use it for things that really they shouldn't. So you could try frying in the bottom of this, and probably many did, and ruined their cook pots. And we have documentation about officers complaining about their soldiers using things like this for frying and ruining their pots. Now, these cook pots are fairly fragile. They're very light, they're easy to dent. If we fry in them, we will ruin the solder joints. So these are made out of either tin-plated iron or just plain iron, sheet iron, that's hammered out thin and made into this kind of a shape. There was a lot of difficulty in supplying these during the war because they needed a large number very, very rapidly, and no one could supply that. We didn't have the kind of industrial base or supplies here in North America during the 1776 so that we would be able to supply, say, 10,000 cook pots right away. And so there was a problem with getting these. The design was very similar to this early on. They were usually supposed to be tin-plated iron. They would have ears and a bail and a lid. It made it a really wonderful piece of equipment, but they couldn't supply them fast enough. And so they slowly changed the design. They took away the ears and they just poked a hole to put the bail in it, and they got rid of the lid, and they stopped using tin plate and they just started using straight sheet iron to make these, so that by the end of the war they were a little bit smaller and very, very plain. And they didn't last very long. Max a year, and it was worn out, and you had to resupply everyone with a new cook pot. Remember, each and every one of these pots is made basically one at a time by hand, as opposed to something like later on when we get to the Civil War, when they have factories that turn out these things. These pots aren't made like that at all. It's really just craftsman kind of workmanship making every single one of these. They're not easy to make. You have to hand form all these pieces, cut them all out by hand, fold these seams in just the right way, and then solder them all up and down and around so that they don't leak. Later on in the war, when these were made with just sheet iron, they would be very difficult to solder. And so we can imagine that the vast majority of them probably leaked, and leaked a lot. When our tin pot is worn out, it's not done. They're not going to waste even a broken tin pot. They will cut up the metal if they need to, use it for something else, or there's documentation for them using these as a grater. They would take their bayonet and they would poke holes in this, and it would make a very, very rough surface. It would make a grater. And sometimes they were issued something like just corn kernels. Now, you can't really eat a hard, dried corn kernel, but you could take this grater basically and grind that corn up so that you could make cornbread. I wanted to compare this with a modern military cooking equipment, but it turns out that the concept has completely changed from the 18th century to today. Today, soldiers in the field, they're fed with MREs, meals that are already cooked. There's no cooking that really has to go on. You can eat it right out of the bag. You don't need a cook pot. You don't even need a plate. Even a spoon is given to you. No mess kits really at all in the modern military. Back in the 18th century, you were given raw rations, and the men themselves had to cook their food. Cook pots were issued, one cook pot to every 6 men when they were available. You could use this cook pot obviously for cooking, and if you didn't have anything else, you could also use it for eating. So you could leave the food in here and pass the cook pot around between the 6 men and eat directly out of your cook pot. Or if you had one of the earlier model cook pots that had the lid, you could use the lid as a plate and share that around. Sometimes they issued turned wooden bowls, and if they issued these, it would be 2 bowls for every cook pot. So you'd have a wooden bowl per every 3 man. You would think that, soldiers would be issued an entire mess kit. You would get a bowl, you would get a spoon and a fork, but it's not that simple, and they just didn't have enough equipment to pass around that way. They did issue something like a iron cup. So this is a tin plated cup. This is probably even rarer than getting issued a wooden bowl. So this is the mess kit for the Revolutionary War soldier. It's big and it's clunky, it wears out quickly and easily. But things go on and everything gets much more streamlined. We get something like the mess kit for a World War II soldier, a simple canteen, and a mess kit that folds together. It turns into a plate, it's got a frying pan, it's got a knife and a fork. This is the classic mess kit that we think of today. This is the simple soldier wear that every soldier would have. Each and every soldier had one of these, unlike having to share everything, and everyone had a kit that was exactly the same thanks to industrialization. There is evidence that at times spoons, knives, and forks were issued to soldiers. It would probably be a pewter spoon or an iron spoon. Sometimes we see knives and forks, even knives and forks with bone handles listed, but these would probably have been issued to the officers, not common soldiers. And knives. If a soldier's going to need an eating knife, he's probably going to have to use his standard soldier's pocket knife. Soldiers always had to come up with a new kind of solution to the equipment that was missing. So they might have to make their own equipment up. We've got things like wooden spoons. Soldiers were constantly making a wooden spoon. If they didn't have a plate or a platter, they were talking about using bark or boards or planks. Bowls were in very short supply, and so they begged, borrowed, stole whatever they could use as a bowl. So they might have a pewter bowl that they got out of a household. There are documentations for using gourds as bowls, and also this really interesting story about canteens. So canteens would wear out, and there was a story about a canteen that lost the top of its head, and it made a perfect bowl. The soldier using that, even getting supplies of flour in his canteen bowl. We have documentation for broilers made out of barrel hoops. They could put it over the fire and cook their meat right on top of that. Early on in the war, there weren't enough of the tin cook pots. Joseph Plum Martin talks about being issued a cast iron pot to carry, and the soldiers complained so much. And in his story, Joseph Plum Martin talks about nobody wanted to carry it. He finally just threw it down and left it in a ditch, because these things are like 10 pounds. And the soldiers were told that they had to carry their cook pots with them. They couldn't put them on a baggage wagon. They needed to have their equipment with them at all times. Maybe the pot would get lost if they put it on a wagon. So there were multiple times that they were told in orders to carry their cook pots with them. Now, the soldiers didn't necessarily have to cook every single part of their meal. Many times they were issued bread, 1 pound of bread per day per man, and this bread was baked by bakers that baked for the entire army. There were people that were in charge of just baking bread. They had portable ovens, and they would go around and they would bake the bread. But sometimes bread was not available to the soldiers, and they were issued just plain flour. So a pound of flour instead of a pound of bread. They had to deal with this flour some way. How were they going to cook it? They could either make fire cakes, which we've done on previous episodes, or a hard dumpling. You just mix this up with water and plop it right into your pot in with the meat that's boiling. Typical rations for a soldier were a pound of meat a day, a pound of bread a day. Sometimes there were also issued things like beer, or they might be issued peas or rice, vinegar at times, or if they didn't have regular flour, they might also be issued cornmeal. It's fascinating to watch the evolution of these very primitive and huge mess kits and what they turn into. World War II, and they're nice and compact, and then the MRE, where the mess kit disappears altogether. I am sure some of you out there have experienced eating MREs in the field. It's not something that I have had to do, so I'd love to hear about that in the comment section. And even eating that way, MREs in the field, it makes me think about how easy my life is. And I am so very, very thankful. Whether we realize it or not, we live in a world surrounded by food preservation. If we go to the grocery store, we have a freezer section, we have refrigerated food, we have canned food, food in boxes. It's all over. In the 18th century, they had none of these techniques, and yet we live in an America that relied on food preservation. Food preservation wasn't invented in the 18th century. To find the origins of food preservation, we have to go back to ancient Egyptians, to the Romans, to the ancient Greeks, to the Vikings. There we can see the seeds of these methods come together. The simplest and oldest technique is drying. How do we get food dry? We want to pull the moisture out of it. And with some items, that happens naturally. All the grains, especially something like maize or corn that we grow here in the United States by the million tons. Corn naturally dries right there in the field. If you look at the ear of corn, it grows up nice and green, and as soon as it starts to ripen, it starts to dry out and it droops on the stalk, and it's got a natural husk on it, and it dries right there in the field. All we have to do is wait, and then at the end of the season, we pull that off. All we have to do to preserve that is to keep it dry. That's it. It is already dried and perfect in the field. That's similar with things like wheat, barley, rye, even beans, rice, all very similar to that. They basically preserve themselves. For example, the ancient Native Americans are using corn as one of their staple crops, something to eat all through the year because they had corn that they could preserve by drying it. It's just not the grains that we're drying though. We can dry all sorts of products. Meat, for instance, we can just simply cut different kinds of meat into thin strips and dry it in the sun. Now that sounds a little strange to us. We might think that meat is going to go bad, but if we cut it thin enough, it will extract the moisture rapidly enough that it hasn't gone bad at all, and it'll be a nice dried product that can last a long time. Maybe it won't last as long as grains, which might last for a decade or two, but it's still a very good preservation technique, and it can be used with something that's probably not an oily meat. Something like beef or a lot of different kinds of fish are just simply dried. Probably wouldn't want to do that with pork or with something greasy like chicken or duck. And it really depends on the region you're at. If you're in a very dry and especially cold atmosphere, drying is perfect. So stockfish that was done in Northern Europe, they would dry this, basically almost freeze dry it naturally in the environment. Perfect. No salt, no nothing, just drying. A classic food to dry in the sun would be different kinds of fruit, especially grapes that we turned into raisins, drying things like apricots or apples, and the Native Americans drying pumpkin and using that for months in the future for something like a wonderful succotash. Not every climate or season is good for drying things outside in the sun. Maybe you don't have sun, or you're in a part of the world that just never gets dry. And if you want to dry something, you have to have an alternative method. You have to have a cold fire situation, or just apply heat to it. Without cooking it, or even without smoking it, we want to just heat it up. So we'll have slightly warm ovens, or situations where maybe above a fireplace in a household where it's always dry, and we can dry things like herbs or different grains, even flowers, to keep them preserved for longer. The application of heat to the drying process leads us directly to smoking and how that helps preserve food for longer periods of time. Smoking meat is very popular today, and it's popular today because of the amazing flavor it brings to the food. Usually hot smoking, it's really almost a cooking technique. They may have wanted that flavor, but in the 18th century, preservation was the important part about smoking. They were doing cold smoking. And that layer of smoke on the outside, there's different kinds of chemicals there that resist bacteria and even insects from getting into the food and destroying it. Smoking could be done in almost any environment. If you've got a smokehouse, that makes it really easy. But not everybody could have a smokehouse. But most houses did have a large fireplace. They were capable of having things hanging up higher in the chimney for smoking. There's even people that lament about the change in the fireplaces in the 19th and 20th century, that there was no longer any place in the house to smoke. But smoking could also be done outside, and a lot of smoking was done in primitive situations over a campfire. You just make a rack of twigs to hold the items up off the fire, and you can lay things out and smoke them for days at a time. You'll get a little bit of sun helping to dry the item, and then smoke and the heat off the fire. It's usually done in a combination in our time period. It starts off with a salting process, and then you smoke on top of that. Smoking really lends itself to certain kinds of meats and certain kinds of cuts. The most popular one in the 18th century is bacon. Their bacon probably a little different than our bacon today. But even today, most bacon is smoked or cured. We desire that flavor. In the 18th century, it was all about preserving that bacon so that it would last for months and months. Today, our bacon probably isn't very old at all, and we don't need to worry about that because of refrigeration. Smoking's been popular for hundreds, even thousands of years. We have stories about Roman soldiers on the march. They're eating smoked sausage. Fish can be smoked in several different ways. You see a lot of very primitive situations where they would just smoke fish on a little rack, or very industrially in the 18th century where they would lightly salt a fish and then smoke it in large smoking situations like a smokehouse here. Another ancient technique for food preservation is salting. Salting can happen in a lot of different ways, and it's been done for thousands of years. We have images of the ancient Egyptians salting fowl. There are several different kinds of food that lend themselves to salting, and several different salting techniques or even ingredients to salting that really cause food to preserve for a great period of time. Meat is a real challenge to preserve, and salting is one of the most common ways of preserving meat. But meat isn't the only thing that we can salt. We can salt things like vegetables or even fruit. When we're preserving meat, though, we usually do either a dry method of salting or a wet method of salting, sort of salting in a brine solution. When we dry preserve meats, we'll use something like a beef, and we will essentially coat it with salt and allow it to dry in the open for several days. And that will draw all the moisture out of the meat, at least as much as we can do in a couple of days. And then we will take all that salt off and pack those pieces of beef in a barrel of salt. And that will continue to slowly draw the moisture out, drying that product out, and that salt will penetrate the beef as far as it can and keep any kind of bacterial growth from happening. But some things are better preserved in a wet pickle, sometimes they call it. It isn't true pickling, which uses vinegar, but a pickling that's in a brine solution. So we will do that to something like pork. So we'll do the same thing. We'll take our cuts of pork, we will coat them with salt in the open, and then pack it in a barrel with more salt, and then pour brine on top of that. That will cause the salt to continue to penetrate into the meat, and it'll cause a softer product. So pork is one of the best things to salt, but it really needs to stay in that brine solution. Now, if we go in and we take pork out of a pork barrel that's been preserved in that method, we will probably have to repack the barrel several different times. So this salted pork might last up to a year, but if we open up that barrel at all, we will have to repack it several times. And each time we'll take that brine out, we'll boil it again to sterilize it, and then repack the barrel. Again, this will last a long time, a full season, a full year, until there's more pork to salt. The end goal here of the brine solution is to keep the meat secure from air. It's to seal that off so that the meat stays good. The brine solution here is a very concentrated salt water. And this is used in all kinds of situations. Most households, they would have a family pig, and at the end of that growing season in the fall, that pig would be slaughtered, and to save up that meat for the rest of the year, they're going to salt that. Besides beef and pork, fish was another food product that was salted abundantly in our time period and previously to that. Fish really lends itself to salting. It's a fairly small cut usually, and the salt penetrates the fish flesh very, very rapidly. And so we can salt in a bunch of different kinds of ways. They would even bring large quantities of salt along with them when they were fishing to sort of pre-salt the fish, to keep them from going bad before they even got back to port. And then a more intense process of salting would go on for some different kinds of fish products. Another classic product for salting that we don't think about much is butter. So today we have salted butter because we like the flavor of salted butter. But salted butter, especially in our time period, it was much more heavily salted, and salted because that would preserve it. It's interesting to look at the period recipes because they use different types of salt, different grain sizes of salt, all in one recipe, knowing that it takes different kinds of salt to penetrate the meat and continue to penetrate the meat. If we use just one kind of salt, it's not going to do it right, and it's not going to give us the right kind of flavor. Sometimes regular salt, sodium chloride, isn't enough to preserve the meat, especially from particularly bad organisms like botulism. If we want to protect against botulism, you have to use something like sodium nitrate or potassium nitrate, and that is included in many of these salting recipes. Now you might think that this salted meat sounds too powerful to eat, and in a sense it really is. It's probably the reason why we don't see a lot of salted meat products today, because you just can't cook with them immediately and have anything that's palatable at all. It's way too strong. So to cook a salt beef or to cook a salt pork or salted fish especially, you have to soak them in water and even discard the water several times, add more water back in. So it might take an entire day of preparing your salt meat before you're ready to cook it in a dish so that it's edible at all. In our 18th century time period, storing items in a brine solution was called pickling. But true pickling is storing food in an acid environment. Basically, we were taking food items and submerging them in vinegar. And the classic today would be pickled eggs or pickled onions. Those are very common, but that isn't the only thing that we pickle today, and certainly not the only thing that was pickled in the 18th century. We can pickle meat, but usually pickled meat is a cooked meat, and then it's submerged in the vinegar. They had collared meat products that they called in our time period that would be a meat that was rolled up with lots of different kinds of spices. It would be cooked, sometimes it was dried, and then submerged in our vinegar pickle. Now this would cause a very soft meat when it came out of that and had a very, very distinct flavor. This is probably the most common method of preserving food in the 18th century as well as today. Everybody can go to the store and get a jar of pickles. And a lot of our food products today are stored with a specific kind of acid content, particularly for that preservation that's going on. What's kind of interesting here is what started as a food preservation technique turns into something today we desire as a flavor and a texture difference. We want that brightness and the little bit of saltiness that we get out of a pickled food product. That in the beginning, it was all about food preservation. Now it's all about flavor. In pickling, we're placing our food in an acid solution. But what if we could have the food create the acid itself? That's where fermentation comes into play. Probably one of the most classic fermented products that was popular in the time period and popular today is sauerkraut. It's pretty amazing. We can take cabbage, which was very inexpensive in our time period, a typical food for the poor. We can slice it thinly, place it into a crock with a little bit of salt in layers. It will naturally start to pull that moisture out, and then it will start to ferment. Ferment with yeast that's sort of right there. The sugar that comes out of that cabbage starts to ferment and turn into a little bit of alcohol and bring its own acid into it. And this gives it a great flavor, and it preserves the cabbage. Now, fermenting obviously isn't just going on here in the 18th century. It's being used for thousands of years all around the world, especially all those amazing pickled products from Asia. Beer is a fermented product, and of course we enjoy it today, but it was the lifeblood of the 18th century. There are places that the water is not safe to drink, but yet the beer was. Now, all we're taking here is converting some of the sugars from the grains, we're fermenting that, and of course, we desire that kind of flavor that we get. Now, this happens not just in beer, but fermenting is going on in wine. Fermentation is also used for milk products, and we can do multiple different kinds of fermentation with milk. We can let milk just sour or turn it into a buttermilk. We can also make soft cheeses and hard cheeses. It's all about what kind of culture is going on and how much salt might be in a mixture to save milk, not just days, but months or even years. Sometimes preservation isn't about necessarily survival, but it's about how to best use what we have, especially if too much comes in at once. If we have a giant harvest of fruit, maybe the best way to keep from wasting it is to turn it into an alcohol. We might turn it into a wine or even distill that into a brandy. Using sugar is another way to preserve food. Usually it's done with something like fruits. They really lend themselves to sugar preservation. And this again has been done for hundreds of years. We have the Romans submerging things in honey. And in our time period, they're sugaring different things, coating them in sugar. That sort of draws out the moisture. And the sugar itself is antibacterial. It keeps them from spoiling. Another way to achieve the same thing, especially with fruit, is to make a concentrate. We drive the moisture out of the fruit, usually just by boiling it, and that increases its sugar content to the point where it won't spoil. Jams or jellies are something that we have today that we use, and we just take that fruit and we boil it down. Sometimes we add a little bit of sugar and it'll keep for a long time. There's circumstances where they didn't know that fermentation was going on. We have a combination of preservation techniques happening. So sausage is a perfect example. We will have a salt going into our sausage to preserve it. We'll have spices going in to preserve it. We'll have smoking going on. And there's also fermentation that's happening almost exactly at the same time. It makes it a very complex product with a lot of complex flavors, and all these different things add up to a preserved food. You probably have canned food in your pantry right now. They didn't have cans in the 18th century, certainly not metal cans, but they did have a way to do almost exactly the same thing. Now, in a canning situation, we are bringing a food up to a pasteurized temperature and we're sealing that food away from any kind of oxygen, and so that no new bacteria can get into that environment to infect the food and start to make it spoil. In the 18th century, they did potted meats, which effectively did almost exactly the same thing. They would cook a meat in a little kind of vessel like this. Usually it was very finely shredded. They would cook it with a lot of fats that would necessarily kind of move up to the top and then seal that off, sort of automatically. And then they would come in and put a little bit of a paper seal on top just so that the fats on the top could not spoil on the very top of that. Clarified butter was sometimes added to the top, again to seal that off, a natural fat barrier to keep oxygen away from the food. And we would preserve things in bottles in the time period. Whole fruit, something like cherries or strawberries, we could submerge them in water or sometimes in alcohol that would preserve them for a very long period of time. And the bottle is specifically made to have a small surface area so that oxygen couldn't get to the contents. Now these are all in hard containers, usually ceramic or glass, and today we would use metal. But in the time period, sometimes they would use the food itself to seal it away from the air. So they would cook specific pies, meat pies, with a very, very hard crust. And the crust itself was not really meant to be eaten. It was to seal the food for preservation. We think of meat pies today and we want to eat the crust, and that's part of it. But in the time period, it was all about food preservation. And the crust was something that might not be good after a couple of weeks, but the contents still would be. So we'd eat the inside and then throw away the crust. There are all these food preservation techniques, and there's one set of people that seem to have to use all of them, at least in one little kind of way, and that's the military, and maybe even specifically men on board Navy ships of the time period. They have to use all these different food techniques because they are away from land. There is very little food that you can just get out in the middle of nowhere. Yes, occasionally you can catch a fish, but you can't depend on that. So they use salt provisions, they use fermenting, they use all these different things together so that they can survive over thousands of miles of ocean travel. It can be easy for us to imagine that we would need food preservation for winter. But the reality is there's so much more to that, especially in the 18th century and for people in North America. You can't travel the oceans, and that's how you get here, unless you have food preservation. You can't move from the East Coast into the West unless you have food preservation. You really can't have America without food preservation. There's nothing worse than the same bland food day after day. Even if we have a wonderful steak, but it's plain, it's without spice or without sauce, we'll get bored of it very, very rapidly. We want flavor. The same thing is true for the 18th century. People in the 18th century, they craved wonderful flavors and diversity in flavors. Spices are incredibly common in the 18th century. Whole industries were driven by spices. The king of spice, nutmeg, brought from halfway across the world to feed England, to feed America. People are just so desirous of these flavors. Nutmeg is so common, mace is common, we have cinnamon, we have lots of pepper, all these expensive spices. And truly, these spices are spices for the rich. Yes, everyone desired them, but not everyone could afford them. The fact that the spices were so expensive drives desire for them. Nutmeg coming from the South Pacific, we've got all kinds of spices coming out of Asia, we have different spices even coming out of the West Indies, things like allspice. One of the most common ones that's kind of looked down upon is ginger, because it was less expensive in the time period, but still used a lot, giving you a nice, hot, spicy food. Now, poor people in the 18th century are just as desirous of these wonderful and expensive flavors. They aren't just sitting there eating the same plain food and not wanting something different. They want wonderful flavors, but they can't afford them. Our cookbooks, yeah, they're filled with spices because they're cookbooks for rich people. There aren't cookbooks for poor people in the 18th century. Nobody's bothering to write for these people. They can't afford a cookbook, much less the spices. This makes researching poor people food in our time period kind of difficult, but we do have some wonderful clues to that. And it turns out that there are ways to get wonderful spicy flavors without expensive spices, spices that you have to import from halfway across the world. What if you can get those wonderful spicy flavors out of your kitchen garden right outside your door so that they really don't cost you really anything? And that's exactly what they're doing. Kitchen gardens are very popular in our time period. Every poor person usually has enough room that they can have a little tiny garden for growing these spicy flavors. While their kitchen garden couldn't supply them with nutmeg, cinnamon, allspice, it could give them some other wonderful spicy flavors. Things like onions, garlic, leeks, different sorts of herbs. All sorts of things can come out of a simple kitchen garden. Now, using things from your kitchen garden like that to spice your food, something like onions or garlic, that's looked down upon. Rich people would call these folks garlic eaters. This is from Nicholas Creswell's journal in 1776. He's in New Jersey or New York. When one Collins, an Irish merchant, and myself rambled about town till 3 in the afternoon before we could get anything for breakfast. At length we found a little Dutch tippling house and persuaded the old woman to get us something to eat. It was a stew of pork bones and cabbage, so full of garlic. Nothing but necessity would have compelled me to eat it, and my companion would not taste another mouthful. The enslaved population in North America played a vital role in developing just these sorts of flavors. They're in their kitchen garden growing those special flavors in things like tomatoes and chili peppers. When researching cooking for the poor, a book I've found that's been very, very helpful is this New Art of Cookery by Juan Altamires, and it's sort of translated for us and annotated by Vicky Hayward. And this book really is outstanding for the time period. It's full of Spanish cookery, so that's a little different than what we're used to, and it does have a lot of different ingredients than you would normally find in English cookery. But Juan here is a friar, and he is specifically creating a cookbook that has dishes that aren't these super high expensive dishes. Dishes that can be done by poor people or even in poor settings, like a poor monastery, which is what he was working within. There were people within this setting that were not happy that he did a cookbook like this. And the cookbook is written in a very, very personal manner. And he has a lot of sort of internal anecdotes inside of the recipes so that we get a real glimpse into what he was thinking about when he used particular kinds of ingredients. And a lot of the spicing, a lot of the flavors here come not from those expensive spices. I don't think you'll find nutmeg anywhere in this cookbook, certainly not used extensively. No, you will find things like garlic, tomato, and other simple herbs to give you those intense flavors that you would normally get with expensive spices. Spain in the 18th century was very different than it had been 100 and 200 years previously. It had been a superpower, if not the world superpower. And by the time we get to 1745, when this was printed, they're on the way down. And they were having a lot of internal problems as well as crop failures. Unlike in America, Spain in this time period had a very large population of peasants, of poor people, compared to a very small population of rich people. So therefore, they had a large tradition of using non-expensive spices to get you those wonderful flavors. A really good recipe from this cookbook that demonstrates what we've been talking about is this lamb and pepper stew. And let me give you a quick read of it. The translation goes like this. For pebre, prepare your meat servings. Brown them in your stew pot. Take note of their weight so your other ingredients are in proportion. Pound garlic, salt, and peppercorns together in your metal mortar. Wash them into the olla with water. Throw in bay leaves, and for every 30 servings, a pound of olive oil and a cured ham bone. Even a bone with very little meat on it gives a lot of flavor to a stew. Now put it to cook over a gentle fire, and when it is done, dress it with a handful of parsley, pounded hard-boiled eggs, thinned with the stew's juice, some sharp citrus juice, or even better, tomatoes. Let all this simmer together for a little while. It is very good, a tasty dish to serve every so often. But take note, the flavors are more intense than in other stews. I love this recipe because of the ingredients it uses. Many things that we don't normally use on the channel, especially for 18th century English cookery. So we don't use at least us particularly, use a lot of lamb or mutton, so we've got some lamb here. It uses a lot of garlic and tomatoes. Again, super rare. You just do not see that much in English cookery. And this idea that it's this very intensely flavored stew. And so many times we think about English cookery, the time period, being bland, right? But this is anything but that. The recipe mentions an olla, and that's a ceramic cooking vessel, something like this, usually a little bit more rounded, especially at the bottom. And we see that a lot in Spanish cookery. You also see cooking in ceramic pots like this, many times in Dutch cookery and probably even English cookery too. And that's for cooking very low and slow. It's basically a ceramic casserole dish. You have a nice, fairly tight fitting lid on it. They don't take a lot of heat very well. So you have to be very careful when you're cooking with these, and they tend to be sort of semi-disposable. They're not gonna last for more than maybe a couple of months, but they were fairly inexpensive cooking vessels at the time period, and so you'll see them a lot, especially probably in poor people cooking. Today we'll be using a black cast iron pot. These are nice thick-walled pots, so they really work well for a dish that needs to simmer a long time, and they're really sturdy. To start out this recipe, we're gonna brown our lamb. I'm gonna cut this up into little bite-sized pieces. For the lamb here, we're using a leg cut, which is typical for these kind of stewed lamb dishes. And then we'll brown it in our cooking vessel with a little bit of olive oil, and then we'll let that stew and simmer a little while to kind of break down. Now we'll mix the salt, pepper, and garlic, grind that up into a paste that we can wash into the cooking vessel. After our meat has stewed for about an hour and a half, I'm gonna add in some smashed boiled egg, a little bit of parsley, and a tomato or two. There's a lot of fascinating techniques and ingredients used in this cookbook, and it's specifically Spanish, but I was amazed by the connections that I found, specifically with that Cresswell reading. 1776, he's in New York, and he's eating a soup of pork bones that has lots and lots of garlic in it. It's almost exactly like this recipe. Here we go. This smells amazing, and it's got a really fun and a great look to it. So even though it's kind of a simple dish, and I thought it was gonna end up kind of being watery, but it's really got a rich stew kind of consistency to it, which is the way I like it. I like a nice thick stew. So this looks great. I can't wait to try this, and I'm really wondering about those intense flavors he talks about in the recipe itself. Let's find out. Man, that lamb is so tender and great flavors. You gotta try this one out. So good.
Imagine a time and a place where for 3 to 4 months out of the year, you could not get food if it ran out. There's no grocery store to go to. You can't pick up a phone and call anybody. There's no neighbor that you can just walk down the street and ask, hey, could I borrow some food? There's nothing there. This is a very real possibility for people in the northern colonies in early America, where winters were very bleak. You would essentially spend the entire year working up to this moment where you had enough food stored up to make it through the winter. So some of the responsibility for you, if you're going to get your household through the winter, is preserving food. And so in that situation, you're going to be potting meats, and you're going to be putting meats in the pies, and you're going to make these different dishes that are essentially canned, although canning wasn't happening, but sealed off in some way. Cheeses could last for a long time. And then there are also things that you can just store back, like root vegetables, where farmers would be thinking about, okay, what is going to be hardy enough to make it through the winter? And they would be harvesting those crops and drying them out and then storing them in a cool, dry place just to make it through winter. So over the last week, and especially last night, just because I'm so interested in this topic, I was going through a bunch of historical gardening books. And it was really interesting how they lay out the entire year about what you're going to plant in the early spring and what you're going to plant in the summer, what you're going to plant in the fall, and you're constantly rotating these crops. And they're even talking about these vegetables are hardy enough, and not just an onion, but a particular species of onion. You had to have hearty things stored back so that you could make it through the winter, and not only make it through, but you also want to thrive a little bit. Now, the king of all the simple ingredients that are cheap and easy to store, they can pack a lot of flavor into a dish, is the lowly onion. I've got a reading here that I found last night from a book called Cheap Repository Tracts by Hannah More, and this was in 1809. There's this little excerpt. They're talking about this woman and how she prepares for getting through the winter and how she takes care of her garden. And in the end of the reading, it says, her onions she always carefully treasured up for her winter store. For an onion makes a little broth very relishing, and is indeed the only savory thing poor people are used to get. So not only are we talking about something that can give a lot of flavor, but this is something that everybody can have. No matter who you are, you can grow an onion. This makes a lot of sense if you stop to think about it. Other than having meat in a broth, what packs as much flavor into something as an onion? A clove of garlic does a lot. In the time period, especially in America, you don't see a lot of garlic in food. They're not using it nearly like we do today. It's like now, pretty much any meal you cook probably starts with a clove of garlic, but they weren't doing that in the time period, and you see it very little in the cookbooks. But onions, you see all over the place. Again, let's go back to our scenario from the very beginning of the video. You're moving out to the frontier. There's nobody else really around you for quite a ways. So you are dependent only on your property to give you what you need for winter. So you're storing back things like carrots and potatoes. You're storing back onions. You're gonna dry herbs and you're gonna store those back. You're gonna have lots of grain. Now, if you want something to be nice and savory right away, the first thing you're gonna grab is an onion, because it makes something savory just like sugar makes something sweet immediately. You put sugar in something, bam, it's sweet. You put an onion in something, it's the quickest way to get a rich, flavorful, savory dish. In this scenario, you are going to be planting onions all year long. There are going to be types of onions like scallions that you're just going to be using immediately. And then the hardiest ones, the ones that you can store back and will get really hard, that's what you're going to be storing for the winter time. And you're going to be picking not necessarily your root cellar, but the coldest, driest place that you have available to you. In the southern states, they were even saying that they would just put them in casks and they would store them in a bedroom or something like that because it was cool enough and dry enough. So when I was thinking about this video, the first book that came to mind is Professed Cook by B. Claremont, and I thought this is where my recipe is going to come from, and it ended up not being it, but I thought that this was really interesting. There's this section of the book where they list meager soups and meager sauces, and among them is an onion cullis. And it says slice as many onions, set them in a brisk fire with butter till it catches, 2 spoonfuls of flour, which you stir continually till it is well colored, and then you put broth, a glass of white wine, 2 heads of cloves, a bay leaf, and a bunch of other spices. So right here, this being a meager cullis, which we've done on the channel before, and it's this rich broth that you put a lot of time into, a lot of fat, and usually just a crazy amount of meat drippings. This does have broth and it does have fat, but the main component where the flavor is coming from is the onion, and that's why it's meager, because anybody can do this. Today we are making onion soup, and this recipe that I want to read first comes out of The English Art of Cookery by Richard Briggs. Another onion soup. Take half a pound of butter and put it into a stew pan. Melt it, cut 12 large onions in slices and fry them brown. Put in some flour and shake them about. Fry them a little longer, then pour in 3 pints of boiling water. Stir them around. Put the upper crust of a penny loaf cut in small pieces in, seasoned with pepper and salt, and stew it 15 minutes. Keep stirring it pretty often. Have ready the yolks of 3 eggs beaten fine, with half a spoonful of vinegar. Mix in some of the soup well with them, then mix all of the soup together and pour it in a tureen. That's the recipe that we're going to go with today. It's perfect for this occasion, but I want to read this other one to you out of Elizabeth Cleland's book, A New and Easy Method of Cookery, just because it's a little closer to what we might think of as a modern French onion soup. It says, take some of the broth from a hog or beef and boil in it a dozen large onions, cut in slices, with black and Jamaica pepper, salt, and a bunch of sweet herbs. Thicken it with browned butter and flour and crumbs of bread. Take out your herbs before it goes to the table. let there be some small whole onions boiled in it. This one is going to be so much more rich because of the beef or hog broth that you're putting in there. What I want to do today is we're pretending that we're in this scenario. We're just going to use water, onions, and butter. That's where our flavor's coming from. A little bit of salt and pepper. That's it. We're going to see what the most basic of onion soups tastes like, and if it would be something that we could consider a treat in a bleak winter situation. So first things first, we need to get to work cutting up these onions. You want them to be cut into strips. And then you're going to get some butter in a hot pan, and you're going to get that melted. We're not trying to scorch the butter, but it's going to turn into kind of like a brown butter thing in the end. After your butter's melted, you're going to put all of these onions in, and you're going to start to caramelize them. Don't be afraid of the onions getting brown, because that's what we're going for. We want brown onions. Once your onions get brown, you're going to add a little bit of flour, or quite a bit, depending on how thick you want your soup to be in the end. It's going to make kind of this onion juice butter roux with the onions. It's going to smell incredible. Once you've got your flour on there and they've simmered a little bit more, you're going to add your 3 pints of boiling water. And then once you do that, it's time to take a crust of bread. Get rid of anything that's soft. You just want the nice crusty part. And you're going to chop that up into bits. You're going to put that in there and let it simmer for a little while. While that's simmering, you're going to separate the whites and the yolks from 3 eggs. Discard the whites, and then you're going to put a little bit of vinegar. I said half a spoonful of vinegar, so vinegar to taste. Then you're going to grab some of that soup and you're going to put it into a small bowl, a separate container, to let it cool down a little bit. Pour it slowly into the eggs while you're stirring the whole time, and that's going to temper the eggs so that they don't cook when you pour them into the soup. And it's ready to serve. Just let it simmer, let it all combine a little bit, season it up with salt and pepper however you like, and it's ready to dish out. Can you imagine being up north where the winters are just treacherous? It's been weeks since you've seen anything green. The last leaves fell off the trees weeks ago, and you're getting stagnant. You're getting tired of the same old thing. And you go and you grab these onions that you've harvested, dried, and set apart for this purpose, and you're gonna make this savory, delicious dish. When this was cooking, it filled the whole kitchen with some of the best smells. These onions just caramelizing. Who would want anything other than that on a bleak, cold day? And the dish looks amazing. It looks homey, it smells homey, it smells comforting, and I can't wait to dig in. Will this taste like what I know of a modern French onion soup? It has the components, except for there's no melted cheese kind of broiled on there. You could do that at home and that would take it the rest of the way. But we only used water, and this looks like it was made from a broth. It looks rich. This looks incredible. I can't wait to try this. That is delicious. It is the perfect winter survival food, and I know that you will love it. Studying how folks survived harsh winters in the 18th century is fascinating. Journals, seeing ledgers, seeing how people were preparing for the winter, and thinking about things like the only food you're going to eat is the food that you grow. There's nothing else that you can count on. It's easy for us to romanticize what it would be like to live 250 or 300 years ago. Us, as we're researching for videos and we're reading books, you guys in the comment section, and oftentimes we'll even see this term called simpler times, or we'll say that. There really wasn't anything simple about it. It was pretty darn terrifying if you think about it. It's the middle of winter. It's freezing. There's snowstorms. Up north there are snow drifts because there's nothing to stop the wind from blowing across. And you are kind of holed up in your house or your cabin by yourself or with your family, and all you have is what you were able to store back for the winter. This is not a situation where there are grocery stores close by. This is not a situation where there are neighbors close by that you can go to and ask for food if you need it. This is isolation. It's nothing new. They knew what they were getting into. But not only are you getting to an area where you're building house and you're starting to prepare your property and get everything situated, winter's still coming. So while you're doing all of that work, you're still putting things in the ground and planning everything so that you're gonna have food stores come wintertime. One of the main things that people are going to be storing back for winter are root vegetables. Now, they're gonna be salting meat, they're gonna be drying grains, there's going to be other things to eat, but when it comes down to the day-to-day, what can we store back at high volume to get through this winter, it's root vegetables. And in the onion video that we did not too long ago, it said the onion was the king for a savory flavor. And for the potato, it is the king to fill the belly. If you go searching for poor people food in the time period, you're gonna find potato, potato, potato. If you're gonna look for food that can be a substitute for something, to make something cheaper and still be filling, you're gonna find potatoes. If you're looking for anything that can be added to something to fill it up, it is potato. No matter what, if it's an apple pie, you will find apple pies with potatoes. We've done them on the channel. If it is, I need to substitute flour, you're going to make potato bread. If you're looking to spread anything, it's potatoes. In fact, Primitive Cookery was a cookbook that was put out in the time period, and it was a way of making cheap meals. In the back of that book, there are several for the dirt cheap, and so many of them use potatoes because they're plentiful, they're easy to grow, and they don't really cost a lot. On top of a potato being a cheap and sustainable way to feed your family and yourself, it is a fantastic way to feed your livestock. During my research, I found this little bit of reading. This is, after all, the chief object of modern husbandry. For if a man can rely upon this potato for the winter consumption of his yard in fattening or keeping hogs, and feeding his horses, and fattening his bullocks, he has made one of the greatest acquisitions that can be desired, since he can do all of this upon land much too stiff and wet for turnips. This was a staple for the homestead. This kept the homestead going through winter. Not only is the potato keeping the homestead or the farm functioning during the winter time, but it is actually keeping the city going as well, because this is poor people food. If you look through cookbooks of the time period, potato is the #1 thing that people are going to when they're poor and they can't afford nicer ingredients, because you can take a potato and it's basically just this starchy mush if you boil it, and you can flavor that however you want to. So you're seeing everything from mock apple pies to mock cheesecakes. They're just having a dish of butter and potato, which we would call mashed potatoes now, but that was dinner. It was, here's a potato, here's some butter, mush it together, there you go. One of the things that you see at the poorhouse or even from street vendors that is very affordable and easy to come by is potato soup. There are so many recipes for potato soup in this time period, but they are all in the context of poor food. I have not found a single one that wasn't a meager soup. Here's a reading from A Country Housewife's Family Companion by William Ellis. It says, several of our prudent housewives foresee the great conveniency of having broad beans, peas, carrots, turnips, potatoes, cabbages, onions, parsley, and other kitchenware ready for use against one of them in harvest time. So they're planning ahead. They're already thinking, okay, we're gonna have all these harvesters in here. We need to feed them. We're gonna store these things back. And then what's not used, that just goes right into winter storage. So when I first had the idea to do this winter survival food series, I knew I wanted to do something with onion, and that was easy, so I did that first. And then potato was kind of like the pinnacle, but I didn't know which direction to go with it because you can go so many different ways. So I started on potato bread. We've had a really popular video with potato bread in the past, so I decided not to do that. And I wanted to think about, okay, what is the easiest way that people can incorporate potatoes into their diet, but it's not just a potato, like a baked potato or something like that. Potato soup is it. And as you keep going and looking for potatoes with poor people, because let's face it, if you're rural in the time period, you're not necessarily poor, but the idea of winter survival food, we're talking about people that don't just have the pick of everything. They have to deal with what they have. That's what I want to focus on. And potato soup is something that you see over and over and over again. This recipe in particular has been rehashed in so many different books for different quantities of soup that they want in the end result, and used in different people's dialects or in their own words, but it's the same recipe and they're just copying it, and they're just copying it for their own personal use and for their own soup kitchen or their own just cause when they're trying to feed the poor people. let's talk about it. Let's dig into this recipe for potato soup just a little bit. It's, like I said, it's rehashed a lot. There are different versions. Some people give a lot of explanation as to why you're using these ingredients. For some people, it's short and sweet, and they're just like, just do it. It's cheap, and people will like it. Potato soup. Stew 5 pounds, coarsest parts of beef or mutton in 10 quarts of water till half done. Add a quantity of potatoes, skinned, and some onions, pepper, and salt. Stir frequently and boil enough. Bones of beef added would increase the soup in richness or quantity. Now, what's interesting about this is that they've broken it down so that you know how much it's going to cost, and they've estimated the cost at 50 cents for the entire pot of soup. And it says it gives 10 quarts of soup, meat, and potatoes, and dines 10 men for just 5 cents. So there it is. It is that simple. Beef broth with potatoes, onions, and seasoning. They go on to explain why this is such a great solution to the problem of poor food. All these people need to eat, but they don't have time to make bread, and they don't have time to be in the kitchen all day. You put all this into a pot, let it boil, and it's good to go. We're gonna cut this recipe in half. We don't need a potato soup that is 10 quarts. The first thing that you need to do is get 5 quarts of water on the stove, start it boiling. You're gonna take 2.5 pounds of meat, and you're gonna cut it up. Now, if you can't find something that's coarse and you can't find something that's got bones in it, that's fine. Just take some beef and cut it up and put it in the water to start cooking. In the meantime, you're gonna be paring these potatoes. Now, it calls for 11 to 12 pounds of potatoes if you cut this in half. So that's a lot of potatoes. Give yourself some time to get the paring done. After they're pared, slice and put them in the water to start boiling with a couple of onions and some salt and pepper. All right, so this is an interesting point I'm gonna try to make here, and it's gonna stretch, so come along with me. In the Christmas Carol, Scrooge gets a bowl of something to eat. Now, Dickens leaves us some evidence of what might be here, and in popular culture, you will see mainly the idea that he is eating gruel, because the point that Dickens is trying to make is that Scrooge is so cheap, such a miser, that he will not even spring for a good meal. Now, I know that popular culture says gruel. I've even seen some people say it's split pea soup. But Scrooge says in the context of the story that he has eaten something bad, and that is why he is seeing spirits. And he gives us 2 hints. And the list of foods that it could be was potato and beef. And I think, and John thinks as well, that he was eating potato soup. It's finished. Here's our potato soup. As you can see, it looks a lot different than what we would come to expect as a potato soup now. It's not a loaded baked potato soup with cheese and sour cream and all sorts of chives and that kind of thing. But it is the most common potato soup that you would find in the period. Most everything started with some beef broth. This has potatoes that are just starting to break down. From the reading, it looked like maybe they intend for potatoes to really break down. You can just cook it longer if you'd like that to happen. But I wanted to have some chunks of potatoes left in it, and we're gonna give it a try. I'm expecting the beef to really be the flavor that comes forward. The onions are gonna come and give a little sweet, savory thing. And the potatoes, I think they're just gonna be a nice mouthfeel and filler. Let's see what's going on. That is really, really good. It's like when your pot roast and your pot roast potatoes kind of come together on your plate. It's fantastic. You'll love it. When I say sourdough, the first thing that probably comes to mind are internet videos on TikTok or YouTube of people that are teaching you how to make sourdough. They're explaining to you what live cultures are, and they're probably even pulling a jar out of their refrigerator, and they're saying, hey, look at this, and it's this goopy, watery, smelly mess. They feed their starter, and they have a regiment about it, and they're so excited about it. You go to a restaurant, they bring this beautifully crusty sourdough bread out to you that kind of has a little off taste, and some people, I'd say even 20 years ago, probably weren't really excited about that, but we are now. We look forward to that. Sourdough is huge right now, but in the 18th century, the time period that we make these videos about, people were not excited about sourdough, generally. Some people, French, maybe, but English people, American people, sourdough was not exciting to them. I know somebody who has a sourdough starter that is 130 years old, and they're so excited about it. And when I hear that and I start thinking about sourdough, it makes me think this is a time-honored tradition, and people have loved this since the beginning of the very first time they accidentally made sourdough. And I don't think that that's really the case. In fact, in the 18th century, they were making bread, and bread was so popular, we've covered it so much on the channel, that it was even regulated by law. So bread is such a part of their day, and they care so much about it, that sourdough was kind of an afterthought. It wasn't something that people were excited about. They were excited about nice, fresh bread made from the baker using yeast from the brewer. So if it wasn't sought after in the time period, then why even make it? That's the question, right? And we have to look at sourdough for what it is, not necessarily what we think that it is. They weren't using it in the same way that we are at all. In fact, they didn't have a refrigerator or someplace nice and cool to keep a sourdough starter. So it's completely flipped on its head, and sourdough is made out of necessity in the time period. If you didn't live in a place where you could just go to the brewer to get some yeast or go to the baker to get your bread, well, then where did yeast come from? And that's the question. That's the whole thing about sourdough, is what's going on with yeast, what's going on with live cultures, and what's that doing in our bread? The relationship between the brewer and the baker was essential in the time period, especially if you were living in a community. They worked together hand in hand. The baker's best friend was the brewer, because that's where he got barm. This is barm. So this is what is scraped off of a fresh batch of beer, and that is where the yeast for the bread came from. So the baker would go over to the brewer and say, hey, I need some barm, I got some bacon to do. He gets his barm, he goes back, and this is how he is getting yeast into everything that he's baking for that day. So the question is, where do you get yeast if nobody's brewing beer? And that's the problem, because the folks in the 18th century, they needed bread. They wanted bread. And there are lots of ways that you can make bread without leavening, without the bread rising, right? We covered ash cakes, and we've covered all sorts of things on the channel where you have bread, but it's not the bread that's sought after. It's not this light, fluffy structure loaf of bread that they want. So how do you create that if you don't have the brewer to go take some barm from every morning? If you lived in a community of people, this wasn't a problem at all for you. Beer and bread were essential parts of the diet for folks in the 18th century. But say you were a sailor and you were going to be away for a long time, or you're traveling through the frontier and you're going somewhere away from a community, or times where it got so cold that yeast was a problem, they couldn't keep it alive. There were different instances where people had to lean on another way to make bread, and that's what we're going to talk about right now with this recipe. This recipe comes from Plows and Politics by Carl Raymond Woodward, and it's called An Experienced Wreck to Make Yeast. Boil 1 quart of wheat bran in a gallon or 3 quarts of water. Strain it and let it stand to be cold as milk from the cow. Then put in some rye flour, which is best, so as to make it as thick as yeast usually is. At the same time, put in half a spoonful of ginger and 1 gill of molasses. Stir it well together. Set it where it will be warm till it rises, which is known by its foaming and bubbling, which will be from 2 to 8 hours according to the season. As soon as it rises, set it in a cold place, but not where it will freeze, which would spoil it. It will keep in a cool place 3 or 4 days. Use it in somewhat large quantity than yeast. A pint will rise 4 large loaves. What we know now is that yeast is all around us. It's in the air. And we have different bacteria that is in our atmosphere, and that is what we're working with when we're working with sourdough. They didn't understand that science yet, but they knew something was happening. So they're boiling this wheat bran, and they're going to set that out with some flour, and they're going to let something happen to it. They don't really quite understand what's happening like we do today. But it's still a very similar process. You're going to mix together grain and water and set that out and let the atmosphere do its work. The first thing we notice in this recipe that we think now, man, that's strange, is that they're boiling this bran. We wouldn't boil this today because we're going to say, if you boil it, then you're killing what's already on the wheat bran, and we don't want to do that. They didn't quite understand that then. I'm not sure if they were trying to create a sterile sort of environment or really what was going on there. If you've got an idea, let me know in the comments section. One of the problems that we often have while we're trying to decipher 18th century recipes is that we don't get all of the measurements for everything, and that's pretty much across the board. So it gave us how much water to use, right? And it gave us how much molasses to use, and it gave us how much ginger to use. It did not give us how much flour to use. It says to make it as thick as yeast usually is. So are they talking about this, where this is the barm that they get from the brewer and it should be really loose? Or are they talking about something that we would might be called like a sponge, where we're wanting to make this into like a thicker, goopier kind of paste and let it rise? Well, the truth is that I have tried this both ways, and both ways have worked for me. I like the idea of keeping it a little bit looser, so that's what we're doing in this video. And you're still probably thinking, this doesn't seem like sourdough. Just wait, we're gonna get there. For our recipe here, I'm making yeast. We don't need nearly as much as the recipe called for, so I cut it in half. I used 1 pint of wheat bran, and I used about 2 quarts of water. You're gonna boil that. Once it boils, you're gonna remove it from heat, and you're gonna strain it and let it cool. Then you are going to add flour, the molasses, and the ginger, and then we're just gonna let that sit. Now, I will say that this says 2 to 8 hours, but it will likely take much longer than that. All right, so for our actual bread, we're gonna create a really simple bread recipe here. We're gonna take about 1.5 cups of rye flour. We're gonna take maybe 3 cups of all-purpose flour or wheat flour, whatever you have. We're gonna add some salt. And then we're gonna add about 1 cup of this mixture that we have, and then probably another cup or so of warm water just to make that paste the right consistency. Okay, so we've got our dough ball here. This is our loaf of bread. We're gonna set it aside in a minute to let it rise. But this is the really interesting part about sourdough in the time period. We're gonna take off a piece, and this is where sourdough starts to come into play, right? So this is called leaven in the time period, and leaven means old dough. And what we're gonna do with this is we're gonna store this back, and this is gonna be what we use to make our next loaf of bread. And the way that they did that was, it was just gonna be for a couple of days, or maybe the next day. They would pack this in flour to help give it a kind of a short-term preservation. If you're gonna hold it off for several days to a week or something like that, you're going to coat it in salt, and then we're even gonna bury it in the salt so that it preserves. They didn't have a refrigerator. They didn't have a way to keep this, perfectly preserved. So they had to harden it. And so the cultures are gonna stay alive inside of this, but it's gonna get a crust on the outside. It's gonna be preserved. And the next time we're gonna go make bread, we're gonna scrape off as much of the salt as we can. We're gonna chop this hard bit of dough up into as many fibrous pieces as possible. We're gonna add water and stir that together, and it's going to create our new yeast for our new loaf of bread. And every time we do that, we're gonna pull off a piece, we're gonna preserve it in the same fashion, and that is how this becomes sourdough bread. Our dough has risen, our loaf is ready to bake. We set this aside for about an hour, and here we go. It looks really great. I'm excited to see what it's gonna come out like. We're gonna get into a Dutch oven right now. Researching sourdough bread in the 18th century is very difficult. They didn't have terms like sourdough, and you can't search for things like live cultures. They don't quite understand what's happening with all those things. You eventually come across leaven, and then you think, okay, well, leaven is just leavening bread. But in the time period, they referred to leaven as this old dough that they were storing back to be able to create bread in the future. So old dough method or leaven is really what you arrive at when you're looking for sourdough. And it's funny because I think a lot of times today we think of sourdough bread as this old method of cooking. And not to say that it isn't, it was just done in a different way. It was called something different, and it wasn't extremely sought after. Like I said earlier, there were some cultures that really liked the taste that they're getting from sourdough bread or old dough method leaven bread, but it wasn't necessarily what they wanted in England. And depending on where you're at and what's in the atmosphere around you, different strands of this bread are going to taste different over time, which is really interesting about it. And it's the same today. So this is a loaf of bread made in the fashion of the time period with yeast that is from the atmosphere and that didn't come from the brewer. Now, it's got a good bit of rye flour in there, and it's got some ginger, it's got some molasses. I don't expect to actually be able to identify the ginger. I think the molasses might come through just a little bit, but for the most part, this is going to taste like a loaf of rye bread. In the future, after you use the leaven from this over and over and over again, that's where the sourdough is going to come into play. But let's see what this tastes like. Well, This is really, really good rye bread. That's what it tastes like. We've got our sourdough, we got the leaven that we held back, and that's going to turn into something different. That's where that sourdough taste is going to come from in the future. Right now, it's just a fantastic bread that anybody would be happy to eat. In the future, it's going to be a little bit more interesting.
What if beer was more than a recreational drink? What if it was made in every household? What if it was drank by everyone, including children? What if beer was about survival? That was the reality in 18th century America. Not every water source was safe to drink, and everyone kind of knew that. And so they would stay away from water when possible and drink other kinds of beverages. Coffee and tea, and especially something like hard cider. But beer was important because it was already sterilized. They didn't know exactly what was going on with beer and why it was safe to drink. We know today that if you boil all those ingredients, you're killing off things like dangerous bacteria. You introduce your yeast and you get this mildly alcoholic beverage. Now, they weren't sure about the science behind that at all. They had lots of different ideas about why the beer was safe to drink. They knew it was safe. They knew it was better than water, that it actually had health-giving properties, that it could make you strong. When we read in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, he talks about workers. The workers, when they get ready for work, they drink beer, and at lunchtime, they drink beer. It's part of their wages. They know that this strong beer makes them strong. He disagrees with that. He drinks water instead, but they believe that it's a very, very healthy drink. Beer also plays an incredibly important role in the military. Both the land-based forces and the sailors at sea, they are given rations of beer, up to a gallon a day. And if they don't have beer to give these sailors or soldiers, they have to give them a substitute. Something like grog, which is watered down rum. They need something like that to get them through the day. Water isn't good enough for those soldiers. Beer was an alternative to water, which might be dangerous to drink, but there was also pressure from the other direction. There were hard liquors that were available at the time, something like gin that was really becoming popular in the early 18th century. That was a giant societal problem, especially in the United Kingdom. Because the gin was so cheap, it was being drank by everyone, children included. And so beer was a much, much better alternative. If the water is dangerous and we don't want them to drink gin, then let's have them drink beer. Now, their beer is different than our beer today. And there are lots of different kinds of beer in our time period. There is strong beer, there's common beer, there's table beer, there's small beer. Now, all these are probably a little weaker than our beers today. They had a much more difficult time extracting all the sugars out of their grains, and their yeasts weren't as, let's say, efficient as the yeast strains that we have today. So we can generally think that a strong beer, it might be 8% alcohol. And a standard beer is definitely going to be something like 3 or 4%. And table beers and small beers, which the children and women are more likely to drink, are maybe 0.5% or 1% in alcohol. In places like Great Britain and North America, beer is a working man's drink, and it's drank by everyone. That means the brewer is very, very important. And in many places, he's very highly regulated because this drink is so important to society. So beer can only have very particular ingredients. For example, the beer that we're talking about today, that we'll be making, was actually illegal in the early 18th century for brewers to make. It was very simple. It used molasses to create the beer, so it was very easy to make, very inexpensive. It became regulated or even banned in this setting, I think because it makes a kind of a substitute beer that's very inexpensive to make, and they could pass it off as something that had much better ingredients. Home brewing is incredibly popular in our time period. Just about any household can make a simple beer like this with very, very simple equipment. If you have a couple of large cooking vessels and a barrel or anything to keep your finished beer in, and then your ingredients, you need soft water, You need some kind of sugar, whether it's malted grains or something like molasses, maybe a few spices like ginger, and a little bit of yeast, and you're ready to start making beer. It's very interesting to delve into 18th century brewing, especially compared to modern brewing. We have a lot of home brewing that goes on these days, and brewing in the last 100 years, so much scientific research has gone into it. We know exactly what's happening with brewing. We understand all these different strains of yeast and the malting of grains and where all these flavors are coming from. They didn't have any of these ideas in 18th century brewing. And if you read so many of the recipes about brewing, you can't actually figure out why they work at all. They break all kinds of rules. Things like putting the yeast in when it's way too hot, or putting hot water on top of the yeast as it's working. Maybe they don't boil the things that they really need to boil, and so there's sanitation problems. There's all sorts of issues when you read an 18th century brewing recipe. And if you really want to make it work, especially the first time, you have to kind of break the recipe a little bit. You have to rearrange it and do some extra steps, because when they were writing it down, they didn't understand what was really going on. They didn't understand how clean everything needed to be. They didn't even really understand the true nature of yeast. So let's talk about this very, very simple beer that anyone could brew at home. It's called a molasses beer in our time period. And what's really interesting is there's almost exactly the same recipe that George Washington talks about. He writes about in the late 1750s. While he's a military officer at Fort Loudon, he writes down in his book a very simple molasses beer recipe. Well, in 1790, there's a molasses beer recipe. It says molasses beer according to the method said to be practiced in Philadelphia. Take 5 pounds of molasses, half a pint of yeast, a spoonful of powdered race ginger, and put these ingredients into your vessel. Pour on them 2 gallons of scalding hot, soft and clear water, shake them well till it ferments, and add 13 gallons of the same cold water to fill up the cask. Let the liquor ferment about 12 hours, then bottle it off with a raisin or 2 in each bottle. Now, if we followed this recipe exactly like it says, it would fail. Because, of course, they're mixing up this yeast and the ginger and the molasses, and then they pour hot water right on top of it. And of course, that would instantly kill your yeast, and then it wouldn't work anymore. And then the whole purpose, of course, of sanitizing everything with the scalding water, they break that rule by adding regular water after that. So we don't want to make our recipe exactly according to this. Now, this probably could work for them for 2 different reasons. One is that if they put their killed yeast into a vessel that already had some yeast in it, like say a barrel that already had beer in it, old yeast would actually be working and not the new yeast. And this new water that's introduced that would, in our sense, break our sanitation rule and possibly bring in bacterial contamination, well, it's likely that this beer did not last very long. It was drank right away. It was a green beer. It wasn't aged for a year or 6 months or anything like that, because by then it would have gone sour. So it was likely drank right away. I've shrunk this way down so that it will be easy for anyone. We can make this in a gallon or 2 batch, because nobody needs 15 gallons of molasses beer. So if we take 2 gallons of water and we bring it up to heat, and we can add about 1 pound or so of molasses to that. All we really need to do is bring it up to about 200 degrees for, let's say, 15 minutes. And that will be plenty to sterilize what's going on with our water and our molasses. Then we can add our race ginger, and that's just regular ginger. Race ginger just means like a ginger root. Then it has to cool off. That has to cool off to a temperature that doesn't kill off the yeast. And depending on what kind of brewer's yeast you have, that might be down to say 90 degrees and more likely even cooler. And we're just gonna put our yeast on top of here. If you have a standard powdered yeast, you can just pour that right on top. They've got their yeast from the brewer, so they weren't exactly sure what kind of yeast they had. Whatever yeast the brewer was using at that time period was the yeast that you would use, just like if you were baking bread. We're gonna keep that at 70 or 75 degrees. We wanna cover our vessel up as well as we can, but still let it breathe. And we will start to see that yeast work after 12 hours. It'll probably float to the top. That's good. That's the yeast working. It's eating up the sugars inside of our beer. It's working, and it's starting to make carbon dioxide, and it's starting to make a little bit of alcohol. At this point, we can actually start to drink this green beer. We can strain off that yeast. Now in this recipe, it says to bottle it. Now they say put a raisin or a little bit of sugar in there. That's priming the bottle. That's making it so the yeast can still work and kind of seal it up, and it will start to carbonate in that bottle. So they made special bottles in the 18th century that could hold the pressure. So yeah, sometimes they had carbonated beer. Many people would at this point just go ahead and drink it. This batch would probably be finished up in a couple of days, maybe a week, and you would make a brand new batch. Now, this is a simple beer. It's a table beer, it's a small beer, it's a beer drink by everyone. It is not meant to be an expensive beer that would stay in a bottle for 6 months. Now, some people might not even call this beer because it doesn't have hops. There are some recipes for this type of molasses beer that do have some hops in it, but generally the hops is just there for a bittering flavor, not there because of its preservation technique. So true beer has hops in it, and the hops is there to help preserve that beer, to keep it from going bad with bacteria. So this might not be perfectly a beer, maybe more closely related to cider than to beer, but let's try it out. It's got a good flavor. There's some sweetness to it because the yeast hasn't eaten up all those sugars. So it's very, very mildly alcoholic, but you can hardly detect it at all. There's a little bit of that ginger there, mostly the molasses flavor. And if we don't use blackstrap, which is a little too bitter for this kind of thing, just a standard baking molasses, make sure it's unsulfured. It makes a nice little table beer. This is the working man's beer. What do you think of when I say the word supper? You're probably thinking something like pot roast, pizza, or pork chops. Maybe a steak and baked potato, grandma's lasagna, or macaroni and cheese. A meal that will fill us up and end the day. But in the 18th century, supper was nothing like what we think of as a modern meal. In a previous episode, we spoke about a working man's breakfast and how that differed from breakfasts today. A working man's breakfast wasn't the giant eggs and bacon kind of breakfast. That was a specialty sort of thing. No, it was just basically a simple oatmeal, fills the belly and getting you ready to start working, waiting for that wonderful lunch that was coming along. And speaking of lunch, we talked about the working man's dinner, which is lunch in the 18th century, and how that was the important meal of the day. That was the full and big meal, not just a quick sandwich to get you by or a simple meal like we think of as a lunch, but dinner was the big meal. Now that leads us to our working man's supper. And we think of a big meal, but their supper was almost exactly the opposite. We flip it on its head. We need a very, very simple and light meal for our supper time. Something that won't cause problems as we sleep at night. Imagine you're the working man in the 18th century and you get up in the morning, you start off with just a glass of water and you get out and do a little bit of work, and then you have your breakfast, probably just plain oatmeal. Then you work until that lunchtime. That is dinner in the 18th century, and that is the big meal. Then you work all day long and you get home, it's time to relax and have your supper. And
it is one of the simplest meals of the day. Maybe it's because everybody's worked all day long and they don't want to spend time cooking. Some of the common meals that they would have for supper would be peas pudding, which probably has already been prepared and is just waiting around for you, bread and cheese. You might have oatmeal again for something very, very light. There's also something like seed cake. I think that is funny, a cake or apple pie. That's it. So why is supper a light meal? Maybe it's different things for different people, but this particular reading, I think, gives us a super hint for that. This is from The Country Housewife. The flesh of pigeons is hard to digest and therefore not judged proper supper meat. It is said to yield a melancholy juice. So there are many things talking about digestion and sleep in the 18th century and how those things go together. And it turns out that they thought a heavy meal was hard to digest and you wouldn't get the kind of rest you needed. So the best thing to have for supper was something very, very light and simple, something that you could easily and quickly digest and then get your proper amount of sleep. Is supper a light meal for every person every time? No. If we are entertaining, yes, then we will have that bigger meal in the evening. And sometimes if we're traveling or in certain circumstances where we couldn't have that bigger meal during the middle of the day, it just wasn't appropriate, then of course it's going to move to the evening. Cresswell, when he is traveling in the back country, they are traveling and they can't stop to cook a big meal. But the time when they make camp is the perfect time to set up for a big meal. So you'll see him talking about supper time and we had turkey or we, cooked a turtle or whatever they caught along the way when they stopped to camp. Well, their supper time was a big meal. Now we might think this light supper was because of budgetary issues. There wasn't enough money for this poor working family to have a heavy supper, but that isn't necessarily true. Here we have a story about the Duke of Bridgewater, and we have a writings about his supper. He says his supper was tarts or hasty pudding, pancakes maybe, or other light food in refusal of flesh. Now why? He's doing this for health reasons. He wants to have light food on his stomach as he's going to bed. I went digging for all kinds of suppers, and I found a very interesting supper here in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And he was living the life of a young bachelor, but he had an upstairs neighbor that he was eating supper with. It says, "Our supper was only a half an anchovy each on a very little strip of bread and butter and a half a pint of ale between us." A very light supper indeed. I'm caught off guard many times as I go reading in the 18th century, and I love it. You'll read into something particular topic and you'll think the obvious common thing is true, and you'll get there and wait a minute, it's nothing like what I was expecting. So what's a working man's supper like? Something like a seed cake soaked in ale? That's certainly not my idea of a working man's supper, but that's what we're going to make today. The recipe of wigs shows up in multiple 18th century cookbooks. We're going to be digging into William Ellis here because he talks specifically about feeding them at supper time to workmen. He's got 3 different recipes in here, and basically it's here's how we make them really cheap for our workers, here's how most people make them in their household, and then here's how they're made in the expensive bakehouses of the 18th century. Now, we're going to be using this sort of middle of the road recipe. We don't want to make the super cheap ones. And these little rolls or cakes are flavored with caraway seeds. Now, some of them are flavored with something like cinnamon and mace and nutmeg, but the common one, the flavor that really most people are expecting, is caraway seeds. If you'd like to make this recipe at home, I will read this out to you as it is in the book. It's a wonderful word problem. Here we go. It says, take half a pint of flour. No, take half a peck of flour and mix it with an eggshell full of caraway seeds and a half a pound of sugar. Then melt 12 ounces of butter into a pint of warm milk, all together into a paste. And after it has lain to ferment and swell, make it into wigs and bake them. So let me help you interpret this recipe. Half a peck, that's going to be a dry gallon or 4 quarts. Mix it with an eggshell full of caraway seeds. Well, we're going to use an eggshell. Well, I'm not going to use an eggshell. Half a pound of sugar, that's easy enough. 12 ounces of butter, warm milk, a pint of ale yeast. And the yeast they have in the time period comes from the brewer, so it's liquid yeast. We can use, a packet of yeast basically. I don't need a million wigs, so I'm going to cut this recipe down into a quarter size version. The wigs come together pretty quickly and easily. We're going to take our dry ingredients of the flour, the sugar, the caraway seeds, and mix them all up together. We're going to melt the butter into the milk. Now we'll pour that into a little hole that we'll make in the middle of our flour combination. Mix that together. Once that's mixed together, I'm going to put in our liquid yeast. This is probably the equivalent of a half a packet of yeast in a little bit of warm milk. Mix that gently. This isn't a hard mix. We're not trying to knead this. We want it to just get fully incorporated. And then when that's done, we can lay that out and cut it into these nice bun-sized pieces of dough. These get gently rolled into a little ball. I cut them over the top with the knife. We're gonna let them rest for about a half an hour or so in a warm spot, and then they can go in the oven. They bake for 20 to 25 minutes at a lowish temperature of 325 degrees or so. Supper for us might be a time that we all come together as a family and we have a large meal, a multi-course meal, totally fill ourselves up. But supper was the opposite of that. It was one of the lightest meals of the day. It was one of those meals where we just need enough to fill our stomachs that we won't be hungry in the night. We've made this exactly like the supper that a workman would have. We're gonna have these supped in ale. You can just drop them right in. We don't even have to spend time and have extra quantities of utensils that get dirty. We can just take them right out and then try them out. And let's see what a wig supped in ale is like. They're not too sweet. They're a nice little biscuit, a nice little caraway seed. The ale is a wonderful, fun combination with the wig here, and it's ready to go in your stomach, keep you from growling hungry in the night, and perfect for a hard day's work tomorrow.
What is a feast to a poor explorer? Is it snacking on pemmican throughout the day? Is it a ship's biscuits soaked in beef broth? Or is it settling down by a campfire after a long day's travel with some meat roasting over the fire? Explorers in the 18th and early 19th century have a tremendously difficult job. They're going out into the unknown. They don't know what kind of transportation they'll find. They're going to meet diverse people. They have no idea even how to talk to them. And they don't know how they're going to feed themselves. Their travels will take them away from civilization for months at a time, possibly years. Today, I want a win for these poor explorers. We are going to make them a feast. To understand the poor explorer, the best place to go is the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804. Right after the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States is formed. The Constitution is written, and now we're thinking about moving west. In 1803, Jefferson signs the Louisiana Purchase. Unfortunately, we have no idea what is in this Louisiana territory, and so he forms an exploration expedition to go out to discover what's there. Most importantly, can we find a water route that takes us to the Pacific Ocean? The other goals are to discover the people who live there, their customs, and the kind of resources that we'll find in that territory. Jefferson needed a trustworthy leader to go on this trip, and he chose Meriwether Lewis, a man who had been his secretary previously. Lewis did not want to lead this expedition alone, and so he convinced William Clark to go along with him, someone he knew from the military. They leave from St. Louis in May of 1804, going up the Missouri River. There's an amazing quantity of information available about the Lewis and Clark expedition because of the journals that they left behind. But we want to concentrate on their food. What kind of food did they leave St. Louis with? What kind of food did they expect to find on the way? How were they going to feed themselves in some of these difficult situations? And what were they going to eat on the way back? In St. Louis, they seem to acquire some of the standard military rations of the time period. They had along with them cornmeal and whole corn. They also had barrels of flour and salt pork, ship's biscuits. They did have a little bit of coffee, some tea. They had peas and a little bit of sugar, along with about, let's see, what does it say? 700 pounds of lard. Another important provision that went along that they procured before St. Louis was portable soup. Meriwether Lewis knew as he was planning the expedition in 1803 that he needed a special kind of provision for starvation situations. And so his mind comes to portable soup, which is common in the 18th century. They're used especially on board ship. He doesn't know where he's going to get enough portable soup, and so he writes to a general about getting portable soup, and he does manage to acquire almost 200 pounds of portable soup to take on his travels. And last but not least, 7 barrels of strong wine, and yes, that does get some people in trouble. Lewis is experienced enough to know that there's no way he's going to be able to take enough food along with him on this expedition to feed all the people both going out to the coast and then coming back. And so they are going to need to live off the land. Part of the expedition is not just military people, but hunters. And these hunters are there to kill animals along the way. And on this entire 2-year expedition, they kill more than 1,000 deer, 375 elk, 227 bison. They also kill and eat antelope, sheep, bear, beaver, otters, multiple ducks and geese, turkey, plover. They even eat a wolf at least once. There are times that they have to survive on other things, so they do eat horse, and many times they do purchase dogs from the Native Americans to eat also. Meriwether Lewis, in his journal, he writes, "We eat an immensity of meat. It requires 4 deer, or an elk and a deer, or 1 buffalo to supply us plentifully for 24 hours. As we read in the journals, we find they do a lot of trading with Native Americans for food. So they'll end up with things like corn, bean, and squash, the 3 sisters. They also will trade for things like dried meat, pemmican, and dried fish. One of the components of our feast will be a classic fall succotash with the corn, the beans, and the squash. The succotash is so simple. We're just going to put our corn, beans, and squash into our cooking vessel and boil them for about an hour. Another food item that is very popular for explorers, and Lewis and Clark had it, and that is pemmican. They were introduced to the concept of pemmican by some of the Native American tribes. During parts of their trip, they stopped to make pemmican just so that they would have food later on. Here's a reading from the journal, July 3rd, 1805. Some of the hunters were sent out to kill buffalo in order to make pemmican to take with us. There were definitely times during the Lewis and Clark expedition when there was not very much food, and certainly a situation with George Shannon. Very, very early on in the expedition, George Shannon was sent off to find some lost horses, and he himself gets lost on his search for these horses. He is gone for 12 days. And he has his gun and his powder and everything along with him, but he shoots away all of his bullets and he doesn't have anything to eat. He ends up making a substitute bullet out of a piece of stick and he kills 1 rabbit. That's all he can kill on his trip. So he survives for 12 days on 1 rabbit and some wild grapes that he finds. In the journal it reads, his bullets he shot away and he was without anything to eat for about 12 days except a few grapes. He shot a rabbit with sticks he cut and put in his gun. During the final week of June in 1805, the expedition is doing a lot of hard work. They have to portage their boats, and these are very heavy wooden boats for a very long distance. Someone even passes out with heat stroke. And at this point, Meriwether Lewis decides it's time to give these people a break. He wants to give them their equivalent of a feast. And so he himself takes time to cook a special dish. He cooks a soup that has dried beef in it
and he makes these special suet dumplings. Let me give you this reading. It says, "To myself I assign the duty of cook. I boiled a large quantity of excellent dried buffalo meat and made each man a large suet dumpling by way of a treat." Now this was the perfect time to make a dumpling like this. Normally you don't necessarily have suet, but at the time they had been hunting and they had some buffalo suet to work with. Now this is kind of funny to think about. They've got as much meat as they ever want, but what is a special treat to them? Something that back home you would have each and every day. They're going to be using a small quantity of their very precious flour to make these dumplings. We're going to mix up our flour with chopped up suet. And we're going to make that into a fairly small but slightly firm pudding. Now, this is sort of like a Christmas pudding in the time period. They would have added raisins for a Christmas pudding. These are just going to be a small plain pudding, and they don't need to have a bag to boil them in. Because we're going to make them fairly small, you can just drop them right into the soup and they will cook along with the meat. On a long-term mission like this, it's very important to put supplies back. So there were times when Lewis and Clark would cache some supplies along the way so that when they came back, they'd be able to find supplies if they were running low. Earlier, I mentioned portable soup. They carried along 193 pounds of this, and it's made by taking multiple cuts of usually something like beef, something with a lot of bones in it, boiling it down for 12 hours, 24 hours, and then letting it dehydrate. And that wasn't easy to do in the 19th century. You just sort of have to let it dry out in a cool setting, and it will slowly turn into a hard, rubbery mass. And with age, it gets harder and harder. This is over a 10-year-old batch of portable soup, so it's almost like a rock. But you add a little bit of this to warm water, and it will reconstitute into a nice, thick broth. This wasn't just a food source, or if it was a food source, it was almost considered medicinal. So this is something that you would feed sick people, and they did that very thing on the expedition. There was a time when they had to interact with a Native American chief who was sick, and they fed him portable soup. Toward the very end of their expedition, when they are almost home, they are out of food, and they do have to rely on wild provisions where they find them. They find a whole batch of ripe pawpaw fruit, and they survive on even that for a couple of days. One of the most amazing things about this expedition is over this 2 years, they only lost one person, and that was fairly early on in the trip. What was likely a burst appendix really didn't have anything to do with the terrain or the difficulty of that particular trip. And it's quite likely that this survival rate was due to the planning that Meriwether Lewis did and the adaptability of the people on this expedition. They had to change what they were eating along the way. They had to change the way they were traveling. They had to work with the Native Americans. This was really an amazing feat. In some ways, this expedition was incredibly successful. They did this exploration and they came back with a lot of information. They had many different interactions with Native Americans. They all seemed to be fairly good interactions and a lot of good relationships made that way. They made scientific discoveries about what kind of animals and plants were there. They learned about the terrain. They came back, they survived this trip. So for all those successes, they failed in their main goal, and that was to find this waterway from the Mississippi all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And because that main part failed, really for years, this expedition was basically forgotten. Even Jefferson, who commissioned it, really didn't talk about the expedition once they came home. And it wasn't really important to Americans until we get to the 1960s. So it really has only been the last 50 or 60 years that people have cared about what happened with Lewis and Clark. On a completely personal level, as someone who researches history, you couldn't have a better situation. The journals are very, very detailed from day to day, and we know exactly what these people were doing, the hardships, the kinds of things they had to eat and drink. All this helps us understand the day-to-day life of a person in the very, very early part of the 19th century, and especially in a difficult situation like this. This is the Poor Explorer's Feast, and it is very good. What is a feast to a poor hunter? Is it an entire buffalo? Is it a loaf of bread? Or is it a full belly and a successful hunt? One of the most difficult and dangerous jobs in the 18th century was that of the professional hunter. He had to endure an environment that was against him. He had to survive off of his surroundings. He had to be able to fix any of his equipment. At any point, he might become injured, get sick, run out of supplies. He might even die. Today, I want a victory for this poor hunter. We are going to make him a feast. There's an amazing time period between 1760 and about 1775 where there are lots of long hunters, professional hunters out in the deep frontier, and they are collecting, they're harvesting deer and beaver hides, specifically for export to Europe. The industry was certainly around 100 years before this, but all through that time period, it was done by Native Americans. It wasn't until we get to about 1760 where there is a generation of people that have grown up in North America that have the skills to go out into the frontier to do this kind of hunting. It is not easy to do. In fact, it is full of difficulties. Now, we certainly have hunting today, and most of the hunting is going on as a recreation. Or possibly some people use it to fill their freezer with food. That is certainly going on in the 18th century. Plenty of people are using wild game to put food on the table. But the professional hunters we're talking about here are not necessarily going for food. They're going for the hides of the animals. And they are spending not weeks or a day out in the woods, but months. In fact, an entire year out in the woods trying to harvest as many deer and beaver hides as possible. This hunting is going on east of the Mississippi. There are lots of different kinds of game in the woods. You could probably think of the king of the forest in that time period, even east of the Mississippi, was the buffalo, the bison. There are lots of bison, not as many as there would be west of the Mississippi, where there are giant herds, tens of thousands of buffalo. For the professional hunter, you might think this would be the most sought after animal, but it turns out that the hides were not very valuable. Buffalo can be very, very difficult to kill. You couldn't use the hides for sale. You might use the hides for other purposes. You might use them for creating coverings for your deer hide that you are selling, but you're not generally going out and hunting lots of buffalo unless you're starving. And of course, the frontier is filled with other kinds of wild game, bear and elk. Again, both very useful, but they aren't the cash crop. They're not the one you're really going after so that you can take something back from the frontier to the civilized areas and make a lot of money. We do have situations where people are processing bison, maybe even salting it and sending it to Fort Pitt. But if it's gonna go out east and it's meat, well, venison's probably much better. But again, the cash crop is the hide. Hundreds of thousands of hides are being shipped off every year to Europe for processing. This is the most valuable product these hunters can come back to civilization with. Probably the most famous long hunter name is Daniel Boone, the kind of person who grew up in this area and had the kinds of skills that it took to survive for months and months at a time and live off the land. The main dish today is tongue. It's a very interesting cut of meat. There are times in our 18th century context where if you're going to take any particular piece of meat off an animal, then you're going to take the very best. The tongue being the very best cut of meat off of the buffalo, it's a win for the long hunter. It's a little interesting to prepare, at least in this kind of primitive cooking situation,
We need to sear the tongue to get the skin to come off of it. Many times if we're cooking a tongue today, we will poach it or boil it and then be able to take the skin off the outer side. It's not so easy here by the campfire. We're just gonna put it really close to the fire and get it to dry a little bit so we can peel it off. And then we're just going to put it on a wooden stake and roast it over the fire. This was written in 1779. First scorch the tongue a little, then peel off the outside coating, then stick it on a spit made of spice bush with the lower end in the ground. If no spice bush is at hand, a sassafras branch works just as well. So what did one of these hunting expeditions look like? It was lasting, again, months, not weeks, not days, months, or even a year, possibly even longer. If you're going to be bringing lots of things out of the frontier, you have to have some way to carry that. Someone's going to have a minimum of 3 or 4 pack horses, possibly many more, because you want to come out with as many hides as possible. It's the only way for your trip to be profitable at all. And these expeditions aren't just a single person. You're going into a very, very dangerous environment. There are times when you have to defend yourself, and so you really can't do that with one person. So they're going out in larger groups, 3 and 4, maybe a half a dozen or a dozen men. You've got a camp, or a camp at least for a while. You might have to move from one spot to the other as you're hunting. You're going to have a half shelter like this, and you're again killing a lot of deer or beaver. Those animals have to be butchered, their skin has to be taken off, and then has to be processed. You can't just take a raw hide with you. You have to sort of half tan them so that you can pack them up and ship them out. And they have to last for months. You know, the ones you kill at the beginning have to last until you're ready to come out of the frontier. So it is a very dirty, nasty, hard job. It is all day long. You're going out hunting, you're bringing back the animals, you're processing, and starting out again the next day. There's a clash of cultures going on here, with the hunters coming off of the coast, and then we've got Native Americans. And the Native Americans here, they're not a monolith. You have different tribes, and sometimes they're at war with each other. At the same time, they're basically at war with these long hunters. So it is an incredibly dangerous spot to be. But it's not just people that you have to worry about. You have to worry about bears. You have to worry about mountain lions. You have to worry about buffalo. They're very dangerous animals to interact with, as well as something like elk. You're so deep in this forest that you're weeks away from resupply of just about anything. If your equipment breaks, you have to be able to fix it. And the most important thing to these hunters was their gun. That's a complicated piece of equipment in our 18th century situation. And you've got nothing but a campfire and maybe a very small hammer and a little hand vise to fix anything that might break. Another delicacy for these long hunters is bone marrow, and it's sort of the opposite of tongue. Tongue is a very easy thing to harvest from an animal. The bone marrow can be very difficult to harvest from the animal, so you've got to carve all the meat away to get to the bones. And you have to have a very large bone to get any decent marrow out of it. But the bones that were roasted, the marrow would soften up and they could scoop it out and spread it on bread or Johnny cakes for that very, very special flavor. I was trying to think of a comparison that we would have today, a job that we could do today that would be anything similar to what was happening with these 18th century hunters. Maybe you've seen the show Deadliest Catch. You're out there on the seas for months at a time. Or maybe the job of somebody on an oil rig. Again, away from civilization for months at a time, no real connection. These people usually have all their supplies along with them. The hunters, on the other hand, they were living on the environment for all that time. There are many times on the channel where we've talked about people in the 18th century using every little bit of something. So not letting anything go to waste. The hunters here are in a situation that many times is just the opposite. They are in a land of bounty. There are times when there is way more meat than anyone could possibly eat. And they'll just take little bits of an animal, the very, very best parts, and the rest they will just leave to rot. And yet, 3 or 4 days later, they're out of anything to eat and they are starving. This feast or famine situation is not with just these 18th century long hunters. It's happening with the Native Americans who are doing the same kind of hunting. When the hides are the cash crop, it doesn't matter whether they're Native Americans or these 18th century hunters, the meat part is not important, and so it just goes to waste. Johnny cakes would be another win for our long hunter. Ground corn, maize, that's something that they can bring along with them to the frontier. They might not want to use very much at a time because you can only bring so much, but that's that last little flavor of home that you can bring along with you. It's very easy to cook and it has that amazing flavor that you're missing once you're out on this frontier for months and months at a time. This would be a line of work for a very special kind of person. Somebody who is able to live off the land for months at a time. Someone who's able to hunt and harvest animals by the hundreds if need be. Someone who is able to fix their own equipment. Somebody who's able to fight off bears and mountain lions and buffalo. He was somebody who could handle the pressure of living in this kind of environment. This is the Poor Hunter's Feast, and it is very good. There isn't one of us who doesn't enjoy a good donut now and then. Question is, did they have donuts 300 years ago? Did they enjoy the wonderful round goodness with sprinkles? It's hard to imagine that they did. So let's dig in and see if we can find out just what they had that we could call a donut. Now, when I start to think about this, I think confectionery, sweetness, that sounds expensive. Maybe if they had donuts, that was something that rich people would enjoy. But if we go digging into the books, especially right there in the 18th century, we find William Ellis's book that's all about taking care of the farm, the simple farm in England in 1750. They had a lot of farm workers, people that were working hard in the field, and he talks about feeding those farmers. And we find out that they do have something almost exactly like a donut. In fact, several different things. There's a family of food traditions in England and in fact all over Europe and maybe all over the world. They would call them something like fritters or maybe even just cakes. The word donut doesn't appear at all. If we go digging, donut kind of combined as a word doesn't really show up until about 1805, 1804, something like that. We do see it show up in a dictionary in 1806 and it says a small roundish cake. In fact, classically, what we call a donut hole is more what the true definition of a donut would be. A dough and a nut shaped, and we can even see food sometimes related to that. If we look earlier, we find gingerbread, and they called them sometimes ginger nuts because they would make them into a walnut-sized piece. The 17th and 18th century French cookbooks have recipes for beignets, just like we know them, and these were popular for religious holidays. And religious holidays are like street carnivals and fairs of the time period. They are frequented by everyone, all the common folks, and they are enjoying donuts. 200 years ago, there was more than one way to get to something like a donut, even if that's not what they necessarily called it. They would make a fritter, and there are lots of different fritter recipes. Fritter recipes usually have some kind of fruit in them. And yeah, sometimes today we put fruit in our donuts, right? Fritters are really close to a donut, except the dough is very loose. It's a batter, and we pour a batter into the hot oil, and it makes our fritter. And a donut, usually that's a very soft dough, something that we can cut into a shape, like a donut hole shape. So it doesn't seem to matter whether our donut ends up like a little donut hole or a big funnel cake. It's basically the same thing. And there are so many different recipes in our time period for just exactly that. The first recipe I want to do is for fritters, and this recipe comes from William Ellis's Country Housewife Family Companion in 1750. The Hertfordshire plain fritter. To make these, our housewife makes use of 6 eggs well beaten, and mixed with 2 quarts of milk, a quart of flour, a good store of powdered ginger, because ginger makes the fritters hollow and hot. She also mixes some coarse sugar with her batter, by which these need little or no sugar afterwards to eat them with. Batter fries hollower in fritters than in pancakes, but then it employs more time and fat in dressing them. This recipe is so simple, there are very few ingredients. Let's start mixing our eggs with our milk. We're gonna whisk up our eggs first, and then as soon as they're whisked up, we're gonna mix up our milk. And remember, I'm only gonna make a quarter of this batch because it makes a lot of batter. So we're gonna mix up these eggs with the milk, and as soon as those are mixed up, I'm gonna mix up the dry ingredients separately. So we've got our flour, we've got our ginger, which is gonna make that wonderful spicy flavor, and then some sugar. Once we have our wet ingredients done and our dry ingredients, now we can combine those together and whisk it until it's got a little bit of air in it. Once our batter is finished, we can pour it into our hot lard to cook these up. The first time we see the term doughnut in American literature is in 1809 when Washington Irving writes about a dinner, and it's got all these rich foods and it's covered with doughnuts. And that, he describes, is almost exactly what we're talking about here. He refers to it, of course, connected with the German ancestry of that area, and they're called something like Olikoken in the German. Our fritters turned out great. We put them in that hot oil, and when they start to float and turn a nice light brown, they're ready to come out. The next recipe comes out of the same book, and it gets a lot closer to doughnuts. This one's called How to Make These Hertfordshire Cakes, Nuts, or Pincushions, as it says. These are much used in Hertfordshire for giving farmers' servants a changeable dinner now and then to their satisfaction. For if they are made as they should be, the men are generally fond of them. We take skimmed milk and hog's lard and warm them by the fire. Then some flour, sugar, yeast, an egg or two, and the powder of Jamaica spice. We make these into a paste as if for a pie crust. We roll it out to the thinness of 1/4 of an inch and cut it into 2-inch squares. Then we boil them in hog's lard in a little kettle or a stew pan or frying pan. First thing we need to do is get our milk warming, and then we can melt the lard into that. We don't want it to be hot. We just want it to be liquefied. This is a classic 18th century recipe in that there are no amounts given. We just have to fake our way to it. We know that we get to a consistency of something like a pie crust or a very soft dough so that we can cut it into our shapes. So our only real measurement are the eggs. We're gonna be just working with 2 eggs. I'll take our liquid ingredients and mix them all together along with our yeast. That's a liquid ingredient from the time period. And then add in our flour until we get to that consistency that we're looking for. It's fascinating as we read into William Ellis that these aren't necessarily for breakfast or even necessarily as a snack, but they might be dinner, they might be the main course of dinner. And obviously they had a different idea of dinner than we do today. So doughnuts don't always show up as a sugary treat or some kind of snack. No, they also show up as a garnish, sometimes a savory garnish in dishes like peas or spinach, or even one with an open-face fish pie. Several of these recipes push these doughnuts up one more notch by adding a pudding sauce and then sprinkling sugar on them. And a classic pudding sauce here is 1/3 wine, 1/3 butter, and 1/3 sugar. We have 2 versions of the working man's donut. The fritter here, and obviously it doesn't look anything like a donut today, but even today in a donut shop, you can buy a fritter. And this fritter, you know, there's a lot of ginger in here, and ginger is a working man's spice. This is one of the least expensive spices and the biggest pop of flavor. So this is gonna have a lot of gingery flavor and should be great. It's got that great elephant ear texture. We didn't even have to bother to sprinkle sugar on this. There's enough in the dough to give us the sweetness and a great ginger pop on these. The recipe says that it brings hollowness to this and also heat. And that ginger is a kind of a hot spice, and it really does a great job in here. Now the one that's closest to the classic donut. These are what we would call donut holes, and boy, they've got a lot of wonderful sauce over the top of these, and the sugariness should be great. And the spice in this is allspice. They call it Jamaica pepper in the time frame, but that's a classic allspice. And again, a very inexpensive spice. So classic working man's donut. Allspice in here is treated like the poor man's nutmeg. It is used quite often, and let's find out how it works out in this. Well, pudding sauce over the top. We've got some nice airy pockets with this. The yeast had enough time to really build up. Once it hits that hot oil, it really starts to puff up. These worked out great. Texture compared to a modern donut, actually a little more dense, but very flavorful. You're gonna love these. When I say the word pumpkin, you probably think crisp fall day, jack-o'-lanterns, or pumpkin pie. We have an extremely narrow view of what pumpkins are and what we can use them for. They're so important to 17th and 18th century North America for Native Americans and for the colonists that we really shouldn't forget them. Pumpkins have an extremely long history, both here in North America and in Europe. So the Europeans were dealing with pumpkins back in Roman times, even making fun of politicians, saying they're pumpkin-headed. Yes, all the way back thousands of years ago, they were making fun of politicians, comparing them to pumpkins. And they were using pumpkins in Europe for peasant food. They were not considered high cuisine at all, maybe even animal fodder. They were looked down upon as a rude and crude kind of food. But in North America, they were venerated by the Native Americans. They thought of them as part of the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. They were what they were surviving upon, even more important to them sometimes than meat. These three sisters come together to complete the nutrition of a particular meal. At the beginning of the 17th century, when Europeans come over to colonize North America, these Native American pumpkins become an incredibly important part of these colonists' nutrition. They really couldn't survive without them until their European crops could really get a foothold. So for years, it was pumpkins that really helped these colonists survive. That was the kind of thing that could grow and grow easily, and they got this concept from the Native Americans. This idea of eating pumpkins did not come from Europe. They didn't think that they were good, wholesome food, but they found out from the Native Americans that that was the only way they could really survive. One of the great things about these pumpkins is that they store. We think about pumpkins in a very constricted time frame. We think October, maybe November. We don't think about pumpkins again. But in this time period, you could store pumpkins for months, maybe 4 or 5 months. They would last you well into the winter. You just need to keep them from freezing. So the Native Americans would dig pits, they would line them with bark, and then store these pumpkins underground. And they would be able to get them out later on and cook them. They could also store them by drying the pumpkins. So the time of year that the pumpkins are ready to harvest is a perfect time of year when there's a lot of sun and the air can be very, very dry. And so you slice up these pumpkins and you can spread them out in the sun or even spread them out on a rack over a fire, and you can dry them out and they can get very, very dry. Pumpkins are mostly water. You can pound it up almost into a powder. And that powder you can use, you can rehydrate it later on. You might use it in a soup or even turn it into something like bread. Now, I said these weren't very popular in Europe, especially earlier on in the 17th and 18th, maybe 16th century. They were considered peasant food, but they do show up in some cooking. You will see them especially in French and Spanish cookery. They're using them in something like a pumpkin soup. So they stew these in water until they totally break down, smash them into a puree, and they make a nice, wonderful soup. And it's also likely you'll see them in early Spanish and Italian cookery. You'll see them in Dutch paintings in the 17th century, but always in that very primitive peasant cooking situation.
When I was trying to lock down what's going on with pumpkins, especially in North America, you don't just find them in cookbooks. In fact, there aren't any North American cookbooks till 1790s. So pumpkins don't show up in cookbooks, but we find them in literature, people talking about pumpkins. And in the 17th century, they were talking about how important these pumpkins were for the starting of the colony. They ate them so much that their brains were pumpkin blasted. And we also see Europeans making fun of Americans for eating pumpkins. In Europe, pumpkins were just peasant food, right? Why would anybody eat a pumpkin? But it turns out that the North Americans were proud of the fact that they could survive on pumpkins. There's a book called The Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, which has slang terms from the late 18th century, like 1785. And the term pumpkin was someone from Boston. Why? Because they ate pumpkins all the time and were proud of it. In fact, Pumpkinshire was the Boston area. Pumpkins were also looked down upon because they were considered a lazy man's crop, kind of like potatoes. Potatoes, you shove them in soft earth and you come back at the end of the season and you dig more potatoes up. Pumpkins are even better. You take one little pumpkin seed, you plant it in a mound of earth and you make sure it's damp, and then at the end of the season there's a giant pumpkin vine and it's got 20, 30, 50 pumpkins from it. You can almost survive half a year off of a single pumpkin vine. In our time period, they didn't really separate squashes and pumpkins out too much. They considered them all basically the same thing. And most of the pumpkins they talk about being kind of green. They say they come in all kinds of shapes or even all kinds of colors. They had white ones, they had green ones, and sometimes it said when they got ripe, they turned orange. So we know that their pumpkins probably looked something like ours, but they might consider this just as much a pumpkin as something like that. So how do you cook pumpkins? Today we talk about pumpkin pies. Really, they're more like a pumpkin custard pie. But they could cook pumpkins in any number of ways. They sliced them up and fried them. They would also roast the pumpkins, maybe in an oven or under the coals. They would boil and stew the pumpkins until they turned into a soup. They might use the boiled water that you get from the pumpkins to make a wonderful moist bread. And they also did pumpkin pie, but not quite like you expected. Here's a direction for a pumpkin pie, and I've seen several descriptions of this. This is William Ellis in 1752. He says, pumpkin pie. We pare and cut the pumpkins in slices, and then lay the slices in a glazed earthen pot with salt between the layers of them all night for extracting out the watery juice. Then chop them with the like quantity or less of apples, and with sugar put into the crust and bake. Pumpkins save the apples, and some like it better than apples alone. So it's really an apple and pumpkin pie all together. We're gonna make a quick pie crust today. Whole wheat flour, butter, and cold water. And the ratio is 3-to-1, flour to butter, and then just enough water to get it to hold together. You can buy your pie crust at the store, but be brave. You can do it. Make your own pie crust. Here's a 17th century reading of an English person exploring in the Florida area. He says, about an hour before sunset, we got to an Indian plantation. This was the first place we saw anything planted, being full of pumpkin vines and some small pumpkins on them. But the Spaniards were too quick for us and they got them before us. Growing up, pumpkin pie was my favorite pie. It still is my favorite pie. So I'm really interested to see what this does because I've never had one that was made anything like this. So it's fun to take one of those 18th century recipes, try it today and see how it compares. That is really, really interesting. It's got a very soft texture. It's not that pureed sort of custard texture that you're gonna get from a standard pumpkin pie. The pumpkin is very, very smooth. Even though we didn't pre-boil it or anything, it turns out really smooth. And so we have a wonderful pumpkin pie flavor with that twist of the apple in there, which brings in the sweetness. It turns out great. I continue to be fascinated by topics just like this that seem so simple and clear-cut. But when you do the research, you find out, yes, even something like the lowly pumpkin was a survival food they couldn't live without.
What is Christmas to a poor man 300 years ago? Is it a mountain of food and presents? Is it going outside and shooting off your guns in celebration? Or is it a day just like any other? In this time period, there were several different ways to celebrate Christmas, and they were very diverse. It really depended on your cultural and religious background. Christmas is a very religious holiday, and there are very different ideas on the ways to celebrate Christmas. In the American colonies, it really depended on where you were from in England or other parts of the world. If you were somebody who was maybe in the London area, and you had an Anglican background, your Christmas is a bit more what we think of as a traditional Christmas celebration. You're going to celebrate it at Christmas time, maybe a little bit after, for as many as 2 weeks. You're going to have meals, you're going to have people visiting you, you will have presents. A classic Christmas. But that's just a small portion of the people in the American colonies. If you lived in the Northeast, maybe the Boston area, but your ancestors were from East Anglia, your Christmas tradition was very restricted. It was almost like the Puritans had a war against celebrating Christmas. The Christmas idea, that's all right. But the idea of taking time and celebrating Christmas, maybe having special celebrations, they didn't like that at all. In the 17th century, before our time period, they even had basically outlawed Christmas. They had fines if you celebrated Christmas. When I think about the fines, I think, now wait a minute, you don't really do that unless people want to break the law. So obviously in the Northeast, there were people who wanted to celebrate Christmas, but they had laws against it. If you were from Philadelphia and you had a Quaker background, well, the Quakers were against special religious holidays altogether, and they ignored them. They worked on Christmas just like it was any other day. During the mid to late 18th century, there is a very strong influx of Scots-Irish into the North American colonies. And they've got a completely different idea. They are definitely not Anglican like the people that come into the Virginia area say. They have a very Protestant and Presbyterian way of thinking about it. But they are actually fairly strong with their Christmas traditions. But their Christmas is a little different. It has to do a lot with celebrating. Let's go out and fire some guns. Let's have a party. Maybe let's wrestle. Let's have some fun on Christmas. And finally, if you're in the New York area, there's a very, very strong Dutch and German influence in that area. And they were also very into Christmas decorations. They were into celebratory things, confectionery, and special Christmas dishes. Now, they influence those people around them. And as we go through the 18th century, more and more of these people that do celebrate Christmas start to influence the people that aren't interested in Christmas. So as we go through the 18th century, Christmas becomes more important in North America. But what about Christmas for the poor person? Which one of these categories do they fit into? And here it, of course, is any one of those. Christmas is special for the poor in the 18th century. It is a time for people that are better off to give to the poor. And we see that a lot in research. We see people that are maybe leaving things in bequests in wills, and they'll say to be given to the poor at Christmas. Maybe they'll even set aside something like a trust. What about the poorest to the poor? When we look into the practices in the workhouses, we find that Christmas is a special day. Here's a workhouse. It says, on Christmas, the paupers are allowed roast mutton, plum pudding, the best cheese, and ale. Looking for examples of poorer people in these circumstances of Christmas, I ran onto a couple of readings about Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark expedition is going out here in 1804, 1805, and there are Christmas things happening. Now, probably most of the folks along on that expedition are more Scots-Irish. They're the people who want to go out and have a celebration and kick up some dust. So what happened on the first Christmas during the expedition? Here we go. Some snow fell this morning about 10. It cleared up. The weather became pleasant. This evening we finished our fortification. Flour, dried apples, pepper, and other articles were distributed in the different messes to enable them to celebrate Christmas in a proper and social manner. Tuesday the 25th. The morning was ushered in by 2 discharges of the swivel cannon and a round of small arms fire by the whole corps. and then each man was presented with a glass of brandy, and we hoisted the American flag in the garrison. Now the second Christmas, well, this is on the way back from the coast, and they are out of supplies. So this is a very different Christmas. This morning we left our camp and moved into our huts. At daybreak, all the men paraded and fired a round of small arms, wishing the commanding officers a Merry Christmas. In the course of the day, Captain Lewis and Captain Clark collected what tobacco remained and divided it amongst those who used tobacco as a Christmas gift. To the others, they gave handkerchiefs in lieu of that. We had no spirituous liquor to elevate our spirits this Christmas, but of this we had but little need, as we were all in very good health. Rich or poor, what are the standard Christmas dishes? What's the most popular thing to eat in Christmas in the 18th century? Well, boiled puddings. Those plum puddings that we see, those are the quintessential dish, even in the poorhouse. Also, roast meat, whether it's roast mutton, roast beef, a roast chicken, a roast goose, or a turkey, all are popular for dishes on Christmas Day. And a Christmas pie is also very, very popular, and most of the time a Christmas pie here in the 18th century was a mincemeat pie. Mincemeat pie with real meat, or maybe if you're poorer, maybe a mincemeat pie without actual meat in it. And that brings me to the idea of all of these dishes. Each one of these we could make a very rich version or a very poor version. As we dig into the cookbooks, we see that very thing going on. Each one of these recipes, we will see a poor version and a rich version. We can make a plum pudding or the classic boiled pudding, and we can put very expensive ingredients in it. We can put brandy in it. We can fill it with cream and eggs to make this extra special, huge boiled pudding. Or we can make a very meager version where just water and flour and a little suet and a few raisins go into this pudding, and we can make a very poor version. One of the things that did seem to be special about Christmas was that it was a time to take off, even if you were a poor person, or in the worst situation possible, if you were in jail doing heavy labor. And that was something that was happening in the early 19th century. But Christmas Day was one of the only days you had off, that you did not have to labor hard. And even poor people, even depending on different situations here and different cultures, Christmas was one of those days that you had as a day off. As we progress through the 18th century and the early 19th century, we do get different ideas about how to deal with the poor, both in Great Britain and North America. People do want to solve this problem because there's a lot more poor people as we go through this time period. People are writing books about it, and they're coming up with ideas like workhouses and the poorhouses, and they want a solution for this. But it all seems to come together at this idea of Christmas. And even if they're creating a workhouse where they're trying to make these people work all year, Christmas is the one day that they have off. And Christmas is the one day that they get a special meal. It's like they want to give them at least one day where they can forget that they're poor. It's interesting that the classic Christmas story that we all know, which is Dickens' A Christmas Carol, he's actually hearkening back to exactly this time period. England in the 1790s, maybe 1800. That's when he thinks the classic Christmas happens. And it had kind of sunken. Christmas wasn't as important, but it gets to Dickens's time, and he revives the idea of Christmas and points back to that classic Christmas of about 1800. You'll notice when the ghost of Christmas past comes, he takes Scrooge into his own past, which is the past of his childhood, about 1790. That's when he thinks classic Christmas is happening. As we look at the Cratchit family, we see that poor Christmas going on there. They still want it to be festive, and they take the whole day and make special dishes. They have the Christmas pudding, we have the roast bird, maybe we even have the mince pie in there hidden someplace, but they're taking a time, they're decorating, they're having a poor man's Christmas.
Winter for folks in our time period in early America was just treacherous. you had to have the right environment, you had to have warmth, you had to be able to stay dry, and you had to have plenty of food to see you through these dark winter months. Now, I'm not saying that it was just miserable. I'm not saying that people didn't enjoy themselves and that you couldn't find a book to read and get through the winter. What I am saying is that if you were in the northern part of the United States where the winters are really bad, there's isolation that goes with that, and that's probably the hardest part. Because of the isolation that I'm speaking of, you have to be able to count on yourself and the people around you and your property to see you through these winter months. That means the whole year while you're growing food, you're eating it, you're still bringing it in and having your meals every day, but you're also storing food back so that in these months where you can't grow food, you can still eat and survive. So far in the series, we've talked about the onion, and we've talked about potatoes, and how those are two really great ingredients to store back for winter. Today, we're gonna talk about beef. We're gonna talk about meat. There are some root vegetables here. Those are gonna get us through too, but people were not going the whole winter without having protein. There was meat available. To have meat available to you, number one, you were likely butchering towards the end of fall and getting into the cold, but you're storing meat back by salting it, by smoking it. There are plenty of ways to preserve meat. You can even dry it out. And we've talked about some of these things on the channel before. We've covered salt pork. There's also salt beef. Two of my favorite methods that we've done on the channel to preserve meals is the standing crust pie, and the other one is potting meats. Now with the standing crust pies, we're creating this coffin. We're creating the standing shell pie crust to go ahead and bake a pie with meat and that sort of thing in it. And then we're gonna discard the walls and the top to that pie, and we're just gonna eat the meat. And then the walls basically turn into this disposable Tupperware container for the 18th century. And then in the potted meats, we're basically taking that meat, we're packing it into a vessel really, really tight, and then we're covering it with clarified butter that seals it off like almost like saran wrap all the time. It's really interesting. So today we're gonna use a fresh cut of beef. In the time period, they might have fresh beef, but otherwise, if they had salt beef, they're gonna put that salt beef in the water and let it soak and pull that salt out of it before they use that to prepare this. If they had dried beef, they're going to use broth or water, or in the time period, they would use drippings probably from other things that they'd been cooking, and they're gonna reconstitute that beef. So basically, they're gonna put this dried beef into a moist area, and it's gonna draw that moisture in so that it's not dry any longer. It's gonna absorb it like a sponge. One of the things that I really wanted to do on this channel for a long time was make a beef stew, and we did that a couple of years ago, but it took a long time of searching to find it. And one of the reasons is because in the period cookbooks, they don't always refer to things the way that we refer to things. And so to find a stew, I had to start figuring out, okay, what word are they using? And it turns out that if you start looking at ragouts, you're getting really close to what we talk about as a stew now. And so this is a rump ragout. This recipe is out of The Lady's Assistant by Charlotte Mason from 1787, and it's for a rump au ragout. Cut meat from the bone, flour, and fry it. Pour over it a little boiling water, about a pint of small beer, add a carrot or two, an onion stuck with cloves, some whole pepper, salt, a piece of lemon peel, a bunch of sweet herbs. Let these stew an hour, then add some good gravy. When the meat is tender, take it out, strain the sauce, thicken it with a little flour, add a little celery, ready boiled, a little ketchup, put it in the meat just to simmer it up. Now, it goes on to how you can make it fancier and fancier, but this is what's important about this recipe is that this is the only one that I can find, at least so far, where they're using flour to thicken the sauce. And that is one of the main components to what we think of in the Midwest in America of a modern stew, is this beef with carrots, potatoes, and usually celery with this almost like gravy-like thick sauce. And that's what a stew is to us. And that's the only example that I can find in all the cookbooks that I've looked at where they're doing that in the 18th century. The recipe that we're going to be working with today is a little bit different, and it is out of a magazine, which is also really neat because I don't remember ever finding a really neat recipe in a magazine from the time period. It's called The Lady's Magazine, and this is from 1772. Rump of beef à la daube.
Take a rump of beef, bone it, then have some bacon, as for larding, but a good deal bigger. Mince some thyme, parsley, shallot, mix them together and season them. Then daub your beef with the bacon, put it into a pot or daubing pan with roots of all sorts, spice, etc. Let it stew gently until quite tender, then take it out to drain from the fat and have ready a good ragu made of carrots, turnips, small onions fried, morels. Put it into your dish and then pour the ragu over it. That sounds really good. Now, whether you pronounce this dish beef a la daub, like I did, being a Midwestern dude from America, or a la doub, and I don't even know I don't even know how to say it for sure, but the French dish, which is what this is, right? This is a dish that's still being made. It still seems to be very popular in Europe. A nice homey dish, probably something that would see you through the winter still to this day. But right now what we're gonna do is we're gonna make it with ingredients that they would have stored back in the 18th century to get them through the winter. So the first thing that we're gonna do is take care of our beef, and that's really simple because there's not a whole lot to do. We're gonna season it with parsley and the thyme, some salt and pepper, whatever spices that you like. The recipe says that. Feel free to go wild with it. Now, it calls for larding the beef. And what they're looking for here is they don't want it to be too dry. In this particular circumstance, I'm literally just going to do a light coating of lard on the outside of the beef so that all that seasoning sticks to it. You can go more traditional method and you can actually lard your beef, but you don't have to do that. That's a method that I still have a lot to learn about. After that is in our Dutch oven, and we have the coals surrounding it and it's simmering and it's doing its job. And it's gonna take some time, every bit of 3 hours. When that is working, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna prepare some onions. You can either use really small onions that you might pickle, or you can just cut up an onion and you're gonna fry that. Once you've got those fried and caramelized and they're looking really nice, you're gonna go ahead and add your sliced carrots, turnips, and mushrooms with a little bit of broth and a little bit of fat. You can use lard or butter, but you're gonna do all this and you're gonna create a ragu. Now, we don't want these vegetables to cook too long so that they're really soft. We still want them to have some body, and we want them to create a nice texture difference than what the beef has going on. Last week up here in northern Indiana, we had sub-zero temperatures. Now imagine that you're in the 18th century and you're having those temperatures. You're out doing your chores to get through the day and you're chopping wood and you're checking on the animals. You come inside frozen to the bone and you smell the smells of fresh cut herbs and meat that's stewing and onion and all of these nice homey smells. Now, I can't guarantee you that any of the dishes that we cook on this channel are exactly like what they were eating. I'm not sure. There's so much difference in how our beef is raised and how our vegetables are grown, and we might be a little off on some of the compositions of the dishes and what the plating looked like, but I can guarantee you the scents, the aromas, they're the same. And coming in from that bone-chilling winter to beef stew over the fire had got to be the best thing right at that moment. Okay, so here it is, and as you can see, it doesn't really look like a beef stew, at least what I grew up eating as beef stew, but it does look like a slow-cooked beef one-pot meal. And the recipe calls for you to kind of saute all these vegetables on the side and make a ragu out of them and pour it over top. I personally don't see why you wouldn't just put them all into the slow cooker, the Dutch oven, what have you, and make them all at the same time. Although I did it this way because that's what the recipe called for, and the whole point of this is to eat food like they were eating, to prepare it like they were preparing it. Let's see what this tastes like. That's really good, really good. There's a lot of spice in there. Yeah, it's peppery. The shallots really come through. There's a lot of spice in there. I like how we larded the beef and kind of rubbed the spices in. Carrots bring in some nice sweet tones. The turnips are good. Earthiness from the mushrooms. I think that you will love it. You have got to try this one. Imagine a food so dangerous, so poisonous,
that you don't want to touch it, let alone eat it. That food is the tomato. There's a famous story from 1820 in Salem, New Jersey, where a young man says that he is going to eat a tomato on the courthouse steps, and people came from miles around to view this spectacle because they thought, well, I don't really know what they thought was going to happen because they didn't know. They were just afraid. They were afraid of what would happen if this young man took a big bite of a tomato. He might drop dead right then and there. But it turns out that there are so many stories exactly like the story where somebody is going to eat a tomato, people come from miles around to see, and we don't really know which ones happened and which ones didn't and why it was such a spectacle. We don't know why everybody was so interested in this. Thomas Jefferson is claimed to being the first person to eat a tomato at one point. I don't think anybody really knew what the worry was. They were just worried. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that the world was so small at this time. There were people in other countries all over the place that were eating tomatoes every single day. They'd been doing it for a long time and had diets based around that. But in America and England, we didn't know that. We didn't know the extent of it. We used tomatoes for different purposes, or else we didn't touch them at all. Now today, if something happens in Asia, in Indiana, I know about it 5 minutes later, but that is not the case for the time period. News did not travel fast. And there was definitely a stigma based around this particular fruit that people were just afraid of it. Now in England, there were people that were writing scientific papers in the time period, and they were using tomatoes medicinally. They would say we grow them because they're beautiful plants, they're great to look at, and they have medicinal properties. All the while, some of these people even knew that in other parts of the world they were eaten, but they didn't trust that, so they didn't publish it. There were some folks that were so afraid of these plants that they didn't even want to touch them. Some people were just like, I don't want to touch it because I'm going to stink for days because these things smell terribly. Other people, they didn't know what would happen if they touched it. They were literally terrified. Tomato juice was really big as far as treating eye inflammation and cataracts. That was kind of the basis for the medicinal use for a long time. And as we progress throughout time and we get into the mid-1700s, you start to see people in England eating tomatoes. And prior to that, that was being used for all sorts of things. Inflammation, soreness. I mean, I've read lists and lists of different uses for medicinal tomatoes, and it covered about everything that could go wrong with the human body. So they started trusting it more and more, and eventually they felt like they could eat it. But it took a long, long time. If you ask somebody today, why were people in our time period afraid of tomatoes, the most common answer is going to be that they were part of the nightshades family. And I think that there's some truth to that. Although what I don't understand, and maybe you guys can help me in the comment section, because I've researched a lot on this and I can't pinpoint like an actual answer. Why would being part of the nightshades family keep people from eating it? Tobacco is part of the nightshades family. Potatoes are part of the nightshades family. They ate those all the time. They smoked tobacco. They even chewed tobacco some. Snuff was very popular in the time period, especially in England. So why are they accepting those plants and not other plants like a lot of peppers and tomatoes especially? I don't really know the answer to that. And maybe it's because they're classified in the nightshades family with tobacco and potatoes now, and maybe they weren't so much then. Maybe it was a regional thing. There's an answer somewhere, but for the life of me, I can't find something to pinpoint as this is the exact reason. One of the main problems with researching tomatoes, even researching various topics in our time period, is you have to understand the nomenclature at the time. You have to know how they're referring to a tomato or sourdough or something like that in the time period. And oftentimes it's not the word tomato. So a lot of recipes from this time period were using the term love apples, and that is a tomato. That's what they were calling them. And even back in Greek times, you see references to tomatoes or something in the tomato family called golden apples. In England in the 16th century, there was a Greek Renaissance, and there were a lot of scientists that were looking into the botanical properties of plants that were referenced in Greek times. And so that kind of sparks a new interest in the tomato. Now, most of the tomatoes that we have today that we see are that we do have heirloom tomatoes and they trace back a long time, but most of our tomatoes still are kind of hybrid versions of what they had in the time period originally. And by the time period, I mean before the 16th century. These suckers go back a long time. There's this really wonderful book that John suggested to me when I told him that I wanted to run down the tomato rabbit hole. It's called The Tomato in America, and it's by Andrew F. Smith. And this book has been just a great research tool. It's wonderful. If anybody is interested in tomatoes in America and kind of the history of tomatoes, this is a wonderful book. So I dug into this book and it helped me figure out a timeline of when tomatoes are being used, or at least written down, referenced for the first time in various countries around the world. And it's very, very enlightening. The British tomato. Although tomatoes have been cultivated in continental Europe since the 1540s, they were not grown in England until 1590s. John Gerard, a barber surgeon, planted them in Holborn in the College of Physicians' Gardens that he superintended. So in 1590, they are starting to cultivate tomatoes in England, but this is strictly educational. We have records of people eating tomatoes in 1608 in Italy, and as early as 1529 in Mexico. Obviously, that's when they're being recorded, but they're eating tomatoes well before that in Mexico. I mean, the Aztec people were using tomatoes, and that's very early, and they're making even a salsa at the time period. So dishes that we're eating now regularly, every time we go out to eat, were being created hundreds of years ago out of something that was supposedly poisonous. Tomatoes in the colonies in the States and in England and other parts of Europe were thought to be dangerous and rank smelling well into the 19th century. But we do start to see them around the early 1700s being used in certain soups. They're good to make a broth with. People are starting to feel like there are certain occasions where if they're cooked properly or if they're extremely ripe, then you can use them. And that continues in 1750s. We start to see English cookbooks that are including Spanish recipes that have tomatoes in them. And by the 1780s, a lot of people were feeling pretty comfortable with cooking with tomatoes. Today, we are going to cook with tomatoes. And it's from a 1758 supplement to the Art of Cookery, which is really interesting because that is the most popular cookbook in England in the time period, bar none. And so in 1758, there's the supplement that's added to the book, and it has to cook haddock the Spanish way.
Take 2 fine haddocks, scale, gut, and wash them well. Wipe them with a cloth and broil them. Put a pint of sweet oil in the stew pan, season it with pepper and salt, a little cloves, mace, nutmeg beaten, 2 cloves of garlic chopped. Pare half a dozen love apples and quarter them when in season. Put them in, and a spoonful of vinegar. Put in the fish and stew them very gently for half an hour over a slow fire. Put them in a hot dish and garnish with lemon.
There are basically 2 parts to this recipe. The first thing that we're going to do is prepare our fish. And so we're going to wash that off, and I'm going to dry it off, get it ready, probably do a light seasoning on it. And in this context, when they say broil, it means they want you to grill it. So we're going to use a gridiron or something like a double brazier. It's going to cook quickly now, so we don't want to go overboard. And also, we're going to stew this after the fact very lightly. Meanwhile, we're going to get our oil and our tomatoes and all of our spices into a stew pan. We're going to get that going. We're going to make a nice sauce. And then once we've grilled our fish, we're going to add it to that and just do a light simmer for about a half hour and let everything cook together. It's going to be fantastic. At the end, we're going to cut up some lemons and we're going to put that around as a garnish. You can squirt some lemon juice on your fish if you would like to. I cannot wait to try this. The aromas from this dish have filled the kitchen and it smells incredible. The clove and pepper I was kind of heavy-handed with because I like some spice. It's hard to say what's a spoonful of vinegar, so you flavor that to taste. Now, I think that the haddock stewing in this mixture really seeped a lot of that in, so I'm excited to try a chunk of that and see how much flavor it took in from the stew. I'm not used to cooking with so much oil, and so I want to see what that tastes like with the tomatoes and everything. Let's give it a shot. Oh yeah, that fish is perfect. It is so flaky, it's light. The oil's not overpowering. It doesn't feel like it's coating my tongue. The garlic really comes through. This is a fantastic dish. You have to try this at home.
When I say the word cranberries, you're probably thinking Thanksgiving, cranberry salad, cranberry juice, or maybe this. It turns out that cranberries have a vital role in the food history of 17th and 18th century America. Cranberries were delicious and they played a part in being a very healthy food. In fact, almost medicinal. Let's dig into this important founding food in early America. For hundreds of years before any Europeans came to North America, the Native Americans were harvesting and eating and using cranberries for medicinal purposes. They were harvesting them in all kinds of places in North America because there are multiple kinds of varieties that grow in different regions. So all the way up from Canada down into the Carolinas, you will find something like a cranberry. So we know today that they're full of vitamin C, so they're just generally healthy for you. And there are references even in 1670s about these being good for scurvy. So they knew that scurvy was a problem, something you could fix with your diet, and that cranberries were one of the very things that would cure that. The classic American cranberry we're used to grows in the New England region, but other varieties of cranberries grow all the way from Russia into other parts of Europe and Great Britain. They do vary a little bit in their size and their color, but they're similar in their flavor. One of the characteristics or benefits of the cranberry is that they were completely in the wild. You didn't have to work on a cranberry crop. You just went out and harvested them at the proper time of year. So it was sort of like a free food source. Cranberries need a very specific kind of environment. They need an acidic peat soil with a lot of sand, a lot of water, and a long growing season. If you combine these elements together, you'll have an abundance of cranberries, someplace you can easily harvest as many as you need. Early in the 17th century, it seems that the Native Americans are the ones that are going out into these difficult to traverse bogs to harvest these cranberries and bring them into the settlements and towns to sell to the people that are there. As I was doing my research, it was really hard to tell if the Native Americans had to sell the idea of cranberries to the people that were coming in, the Europeans, or whether the Europeans already had a desire for them. The chances are that the Europeans were already at least familiar with cranberries, and we see cranberries being sold. We have documents of cranberries being sold as early as 1648 to the colonists. Now, the earliest North American reference that I can find for cranberries is from 1647, and we have a missionary, John Eliot, and he writes this: "Why are strawberries sweet and cranberries sour? There is no reason but the wonderful work of God that made them so." Starting in 1672, we see references of cranberries popping up more. In the book New England Rarities, they talk about cranberries. They say, "The Indians and the English use them much, boiling them with sugar for a sauce to eat with their meat. It is a delicate sauce, especially for roasted mutton, and some make tarts of them as with gooseberries." So 25 years after the first reference we have for cranberries in North America, we have a recipe here that is exactly what we would use cranberries for today. A cranberry sauce that's basically just cranberries and sugar and water. So we might think that cranberries were like pumpkins in that they were a lowly food, but I don't think that is true. We have a couple of different reasons to base on the idea that they're an expensive food. One of them is what happens in 1677. In Massachusetts, the colony has been bad. They have allowed the coining of money, which they didn't really have permission to do, and they want to make it back up to the king. They want to send King Charles II a present, so they send the very best that they've got. They send barrels of codfish, they send barrels of samp, which is made out of corn, and 10 barrels of cranberries. It wasn't a joke. They were trying to be nice. There's another reason why I think this cranberry sauce was high-end, and that is if we look in the English cookbooks of the 18th century, we might not find recipes for cranberry sauce, but we will find references in their diagrams of banquet tables. They'll show you what to put on the banquet table and where. So put your pheasant here, put your green beans there, and then right there in the middle, cranberry sauce, usually right beside pheasant. It wasn't until 1816 that people tried to farm cranberries. Before that, all the cranberries were wild harvested. Peter Kalm talks about cranberries in 1748 in his journals when he's in North America. And he says that they make them into a jelly and that they're very prolific. They're brought into the market on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and that there are so many cranberries that they are preserved in barrels and shipped to Europe and to the West Indies. It's kind of crazy that these cranberries were so popular that we were able to preserve them and ship them into Europe before we even started farming them. Another great part about the cranberries is that even though you harvest them in a very kind of short time period, they preserve well, and you can have them basically all year round. We preserve them in a couple of different ways. You can make them into a jelly, but it's so much easier. These cranberries just preserve in a bottle or a jar. So if you wanted to preserve them for a long period of time, you might submerge them in water, but that's it. Basically a bottle or a barrel full of water, you put these cranberries in and they're gonna last a long time. And then many of the other references, you just put them dry into a bottle and seal it well. That's it. Some people said they would last for up to 2 years. I don't think they're gonna last that long, but maybe what they think of as lasting for a long time. Also, they would last quite a while right there in the bog. Some people liked the cranberries better the spring after they were ripe. So they would sit in the bog all winter long, sort of frozen. Maybe they would, unfreeze and then freeze again. That would change their flavor and make them a little sweeter. And some people thought that was the best flavor of all. We're going to make the two most popular cranberry dishes of the time period, a wonderful cranberry sauce and a delicious cranberry tart. Let's go back to that 1677 journal and let's make a cranberry sauce. We're gonna take our cranberries and stew them. I'm gonna slice these guys in half, put them in water, and we're gonna simmer them until they release their juices. So today we can put any kind of sauce we want on our meat. We've got ketchups and barbecue sauces and all kinds of vinegar and mustard, whatever you want. The sky's the limit. They had very few choices for the kinds of sauces. They had to make their sauces. And this cranberry sauce is one that was so popular in the time period that they would use it for virtually any kind of meat. Sometimes it was even a joke that they would use it on something like fish or lobster. Yes, it was that popular. For our cranberry tart recipe, we're going to Amelia Simmons's American Cookery Cookbook from 1796. This cookbook is wonderful because it is full of Thanksgiving Day recipes, basically. And it is the first American cookbook that was written by somebody in America, not just printed here. So it's got recipes for turkey and pumpkin pie and squash pudding. That's perfect for Thanksgiving. And also we have a cranberry tart. It doesn't have a cranberry sauce, but if you read this cranberry tart recipe, you almost have exactly the same thing. It says, and this is the shortest recipe ever, cranberry tarts. Stewed, strained, and sweetened. Put into a paste. Bake gently. That's it. She's basically making a cranberry sauce and then she's putting it in a tart dish. So that's what we're gonna do for our cranberry tart. I love digging into these seemingly simple topics like cranberries. We think it's just gonna be a quick and easy research project, and it just goes deeper and deeper, and we find out how important cranberries were to 17th and 18th century America, how important they were as a food source, and how important they were for the health of the people that are settling in North America. Our cranberry tart is ready to taste, and I think about this in the context of a meal in the 18th century and how right at the end of this meal you have this massive boost of flavor that comes in. It's just mind-blowing how intense something like this is at the end of the meal, and this is essentially exactly how we would make it today. Let's try it out. The crust is there and it balances this out perfectly. The tartness of the cranberries all comes together and it gives us a great combination flavor, the perfect ending to any meal.